She was 21 and homeless. No lease, no bed, no family door left open. Just a canvas duffel and $5 worn she had kept folded inside her grandfather's old rope gauge. And with that $5, she bought a hemp rope walk abandoned near Port Orford in Curry County, Oregon, a coastal place that had fallen off county working maps in 1979. The roof sagged where winter rain had worried it. One wall leaned toward the blackberry thicket. The county had said the building had been closed since 1986 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the twisting post, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 80 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Callie Mae Whitaker had been twisting her whole life without knowing it. Not twisting in anger, though. Anger had visited her doorway more than once and stood there with its hat in its hands, not twisting in deceit, though she had known people who could take the plainest truth and bend it until it no longer resembled anything honest. Callie had been twisting the way fibre twists when patient hands draw it backward and let it gather strength. She had been made of separate strands: hunger, caution, memory, stubbornness, and a kind of careful mercy she had never been able to spend completely, no matter how cold the room became. She was born inland, where the damp hills of western Oregon rose behind towns that smelled of wet cedar, diesel, and apples left too long in a crate. Her first memories were not large ones: a blue enamel bowl on a kitchen table, the tick of a wall clock shaped like a schoolhouse, her mother's hands rinsing rice under a thin stream of water while evenings settled in the windows, a father's coat hanging by the door for 2 years after he left, its elbows polished smooth, the pockets empty except for a fishing license, and a cough drop gone soft in its wrapper. Callie learned early that adults could disappear without moving very far. Her father, Daniel Whitaker, did not vanish into death or war or any story clean enough to be understood by a child. He drove south one Tuesday to look for work in Coos Bay and came back twice in the next 6 months, thinner each time, carrying gifts he could not afford and apologies he had not yet learned how to mean. Then the calls became shorter, then they stopped. Her mother, Elise, kept his coat by the door until the winter Callie turned 7, when she folded it into a paper grocery sack and set it outside for a church clothing drive before breakfast. Elise Whitaker was not unkind. That was what made later things harder to hold in the hand. She was soft-spoken with strangers, quick to bring soup to a neighbour, exact with bills, and always tired in the way a woman gets tired when every month arrives carrying a small threat. She worked the early shift at a care home and the late shift 3 evenings a week at a laundromat where the machines shook the floor and left the air tasting of coins. She kept a calendar by the refrigerator with due dates circled in red pencil: rent, light, water, insurance, shoes. When Callie was little, she believed all mothers stood at sinks in the half-dark, counting spoons before putting them away. She believed all houses went silent when an envelope appeared in the mailbox with a plastic window in the front. She learned how to move quietly, how to stretch cereal with toast, how to pretend not to hear her mother crying in the bathroom with the fan running. Love was present in that house, but it came wrapped in worry. It sat down at the table and forgot to eat. The person who gave Callie a different kind of quiet was her grandfather, Amos Whitaker. Amos lived 43 miles west in a narrow house that leaned toward the sea, though it was not truly near the water. He had worked most of his life with his hands, first in a cannery, then on dock crews, then repairing nets and lines for fishermen who still trusted rope more than plastic when weather turned hard. By the time Callie was old enough to remember him clearly, his hair had gone white at the temples and his shoulders had rounded forward, but his hands remained exact. They were broad hands, brown-spotted, scarred at the knuckles, with nails kept short and clean by habit rather than vanity. Every other Saturday, when Elise could spare the gasoline, she drove Callie to Amos's place before sunrise. If there was no gas, Amos came in his old green pickup, the passenger door tied shut from the inside with a length of manila line. He would tap the horn once, never twice, and Callie would come out carrying a cloth bag with library books and an apple. The pickup smelled of coffee, tarred twine, wool, and the faint salt scent that clung to him no matter how far inland he drove. His workshop stood behind the house, a long shed with plank walls and high narrow windows dusted white by years of weather. It was not a full rope walk like the ones that had once stretched behind shipyards and sail lofts along the coast. It was a modest teaching place, made for demonstration and repair, hooks on one end, a hand crank at the other, pegboards holding marlin spikes, serving mallets, rope wrenches, wooden fids, whipping twine, beeswax, and small cards of fibre labelled in Amos's careful writing: hemp, flax, sisal, jute, cotton. He never began by explaining. He began by sweeping. Callie would stand inside the door waiting, while he handed her the short broom with the cracked handle. Together they swept the plank floor from the windows toward the threshold. Dust moved in pale lines. Mice sometimes left husks of seed in the corners. Rain tapped the roof with the slow patience of someone thinking. Only when the floor was clean would Amos open the tin of fibre, lift a hank, and let Callie touch it. "Do not hurry what has to hold," he told her once, when she was 9 and impatient with a strand that kept loosening under her fingers. He said it without scolding, as if he were naming weather. For years she believed he meant rope. Later she understood he had been speaking about nearly everything that lasts. A knot, a promise, a roof beam, a life that has been pulled thin. Strength did not come from force alone. It came from direction, tension, return, and time. Their weekends followed the same kept rhythm. Coffee for him, cocoa for her, both poured into chipped mugs, sweeping, sorting, measuring, then the slow practice of making 3-week lengths behave as one. Amos taught her how hemp was retted, broken, scutched, hackled, and drawn into line. He showed her how a rope walk needed distance because short patience made short cordage. He taught her that good rope was not merely twisted but balanced, each strand answering the others so the whole length would not kink back on itself. Sometimes he spoke of the old coastal trades that had served fishermen, farmers, loggers, boat builders, and households before machines and imports changed the price of everything. He knew the names of closed places the way other men knew ball scores: a sail loft in Astoria, a chandlery in Newport, a net house in Bandon, a rope shed south of Port Orford, where he said the long room had once smelled like dry hemp and whale oil soap, and men walked backward all day with fibre running through their hands like pale water. Callie liked that image best, a person walking backward to make something that would hold another person forward. By 12, she could lay a simple 3-strand rope under Amos's eye. By 14, she could splice an eye clean enough that he lifted it to the window and nodded. By 16, she understood the difference between a useful knot and a proud one. A useful knot did its work without asking to be admired. A proud knot tightened at the wrong time and betrayed the hand that tied it. Amos did not praise often. When he approved, he placed the finished work on the bench and rested one finger on it. That was enough. Callie came to prefer that careful silence over applause, over bright words that vanished the moment they were spoken. In his shop, nothing had to be sold to matter. Nothing had to be new to be worthy of keeping. Then, in November of the year she turned 17, Amos fell on the back steps after a frost. He lived 9 days after that fall, though. Living is not the same as returning. Callie visited him at the hospital, where the rooms smelled of plastic tubing, weak coffee and flowers beginning to sour in vases. His hands were restless on the blanket. Once when she placed the old rope gauge in his palm, his fingers closed around it before his eyes opened. He knew that tool by touch. It was a flat piece of brass, worn bright at the edges, with notches for measuring diameter and a small hole where a cord could pass through. "Keep your hands honest," he murmured. Those were the last words he said clearly to her. After the funeral, the workshop changed hands without ceremony. Amos had owed more than anyone had told Callie. Medical bills, property tax, an old loan against the house, small debts gathered like burrs on wool. By the time the adults finished speaking with banks and county offices, Most of the tools had disappeared into boxes marked for auction. Callie found out too late. The serving mallet, the fids, the hand crank, the labelled fibre cards, the wooden Swift Amos had repaired twice with walnut pegs. All of it went somewhere she could not follow. She kept only what had been in his hospital room, the brass rope gauge, a pocket knife with one cracked scale, and a folded scrap of paper where he had once written 3 words for her in pencil. Slow is true. Her mother married Warren Pike 2 summers later. Warren was not loud in the beginning. That too made him difficult to explain. He was a man who set his boots evenly beside the door and wiped the sink dry after shaving. He worked in property management for a man who owned 4 duplexes, 2 storage rows, and a small office with smoked glass windows. Warren liked rules when he was the one holding them. He liked ledgers, keys, laminated notices, locks that turned cleanly, and the particular feeling of being able to say no from behind a desk. He brought order into the house, but not peace. Order can be a hard floor. It can shine and still not welcome bare feet. At first he fixed the loose cabinet hinge, he replaced the broken porch bulb. He bought Elise a winter coat with a belt and looked at Callie as if expecting gratitude for the warmth he had purchased near her. He did not forbid Amos's things, not exactly, he only moved them. The rope gauge vanished from the kitchen drawer and appeared in a shoebox in Callie's closet. The pocket knife was called unsafe. The scrap of paper was called clutter when it slipped from a book and landed near the couch. By 19, Callie knew how to make herself narrow in that house. She worked mornings at a bakery in Grants Pass, washing trays and shaping rolls before the customers arrived. She cleaned rooms at a roadside motel 2 afternoons a week. She gave Elise cash in envelopes marked groceries and utilities, though Warren had begun calling it rent with a dry little smile. He liked that word, rent. It made daughterhood sound temporary. There was no single storm, no broken plate, no door slammed hard enough to make a neighbour look up. There was only the steady weather of being unwanted in a place where her childhood height marks still hid behind the pantry door. Warren's disapproval collected in corners, a glance at her shoes, a pause before answering her. A receipt moved from one side of the table to the other, like evidence. On September 18th, 2022. Rain came down early and stayed. Callie returned from the bakery with flour dried along one sleeve and her last paycheck folded in her coat pocket. On the porch sat a black contractor bag tied with orange string. Beside it was her canvas duffel, damp at the bottom, and on top of the duffel lay the brass rope gauge, cold from the air. For a moment she saw only the gauge, its worn edges beaded with rain, and some part of her reached backward toward Amos's shop so sharply that she had to put one hand against the porch post. Warren opened the door before she knocked. He had dressed for work, though it was nearly evening. Grey shirt. Belt. Keys clipped at his hip. Behind him. The hallway light was on, and Callie could see her mother standing near the kitchen entrance with both hands folded into a dish towel. Elise did not look surprised. That was the first thing Callie understood. Warren held out a folded paper. You have until sundown to leave this house. 8 words. Each one plain. Each one set down like a brick. Callie did not take the paper at first. Rain ticked from the porch roof into the dead geranium pot by the steps. A car passed slowly on the street, tires whispering through water. Somewhere inside the house, the dryer buzzed once and stopped. Elise looked at the floor, then at the window, then at the towel in her hands, which she began twisting as if it had done wrong and needed wringing. Callie waited for her mother to speak. Elise's mouth opened a little. Closed. Her fingers tightened in the towel until the knuckles paled. That was the betrayal. Not shouting. Not accusation. Not choosing Warren with a declaration or a raised hand. Only silence, held carefully in both hands. While her daughter stood in the rain beside a duffel bag and a black sack of clothes. Callie bent and picked up the rope gauge. She slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat. Then she lifted the duffel, slung it over one shoulder, and took the contractor bag by its wet knot. The paper remained in Warren's hand. He lowered it after a while. She left without saying goodbye, because there are goodbyes that ask too much from the person being put out. For 6 weeks Callie lived in weather. The first night she slept behind the bakery in Grants Pass, under the narrow awning near the delivery door, with flattened cardboard beneath her and the contractor bag for a pillow. At 4 a.m, the assistant manager found her, looked away, then left a paper cup of coffee on the milk crate without speaking. Callie drank it after he went inside. It was bitter and lukewarm. She remembered it anyway. She spent 3 nights at a church shelter where the cots stood in rows and every cough travelled the room. A woman named Nadine gave her a pair of wool socks with one heel darned in blue thread. Callie wore them until the threads thinned under her toes. After that she rode a county bus west with $11.83 in her pocket, thinking the coast might have seasonal cleaning work, fish packing, motel laundry, anything with a sink, a broom, and an hour she could sell. In Coos Bay she slept 2 nights in a laundromat that stayed open until midnight, folding and refolding the same 3 shirts whenever anyone glanced too long in her direction. The attendant, an older man with a silver braid, let her remain until the machines went still. On the 3rd night a different attendant shook his head before she sat down, and Callie moved on. In North Bend she found a bus shelter with scratched plastic walls that cut the wind poorly but kept the rain from her face. She woke there with her left hand cramped around the duffel strap and gulls crying over the highway. Her money became exact. $7.16 after instant oatmeal, a banana and a thrift store sweater with one missing cuff button. $5.92 after bus fare to Bandon. $5.23 after a cup of soup she made last 2 meals by eating slowly and drinking all the broth. Bandon had cranberry bogs, grey water and houses with lights that looked tender from the outside. Callie spent 1 night in a hay barn 3 miles north of town after asking a farmer's wife if there was any work. There was no work, but the woman looked at Callie's face, then at the weather, and said the barn was empty if Callie was gone by morning. The hay smelled of dust, mice and summer stored past its season. Callie slept deeper there than she meant to, and woke with chaff in her hair. By the 5th week she had stopped imagining anyone would come looking. This was not bitterness, it was arithmetic. People continued in the direction they had chosen. Her mother would rinse dishes, Warren would turn keys, the bakery would hire someone else to wash trays before dawn. Callie's absence would make a space at first, then a habit, then nothing anyone had to name. She kept the rope gauge in her coat pocket and touched it when she needed to remember the size of her own hand. The weather grew colder after Halloween. Mornings came wet and metallic, with the kind of coastal chill that did not fall so much as enter. She drifted south in short movements, from Bandon to Langlois, from Langlois toward Port Orford, taking rides when offered by women, refusing them when the driver's eyes stayed too long on the duffel. She washed in gas station restrooms. She learned which grocery stores marked down bread at closing. She learned that shame has a smell only to the person carrying it. On a Thursday afternoon, with rain coming sideways off the Pacific and her last $5 folded into the brass gauge's little cloth sleeve, Callie entered the Port Orford Public Library because libraries were among the few places a person could sit without buying the right to be indoors. The building was warm in a modest way, not overheated, not generous, just warm enough to loosen her shoulders. A bulletin board stood near the entrance, crowded with notices for piano lessons, lost cats, a church rummage sale, firewood clam permits, grief counselling, and a faded flyer about tsunami evacuation routes. Callie read each page slowly because reading gave her a reason to stand still. Near the bottom, partly covered by a curling announcement for a holiday craft fair, was a county surplus notice printed on pale yellow paper. Abandoned structure and narrow parcel. Former rope walk. No utilities. No warranty. Buyer responsible for all hazards, fees, and removal orders. Minimum bid $5. Inquiry at Curry County Clerk Annex. Port Orford Desk. Final day for claim, November 3, 2022. Someone had written in pencil beneath the typed lines, derelict, Condemned. Access uncertain. Former rope walk. The words did not brighten. They did not call out. They simply opened a small door inside her memory. And on the other side was Amos sweeping a plank floor before dawn. Hooks on a wall. Hemp drawn between fingers. The slow backward walking that made weak strands useful. Callie stood there long enough that a librarian at the desk glanced over and asked if she needed help. The woman had silver glasses on a chain and a cardigan with wooden buttons. Callie shook her head, then nodded, then asked in a voice roughened by disuse whether the clerk's annex was far. 6 blocks, the librarian said, but they close at 4. The wall clock above the children's shelves read 3:17. Callie copied the address onto the back of a grocery receipt with a pencil from the catalogue table. Her hand was not steady, so she wrote it twice. Then she sat in a chair near the window and took the $5 from the sleeve. 1 bill, soft as cloth at the crease. It had passed through registers, pockets, tip jars, maybe a child's birthday card, maybe a church collection plate. Now it lay across her palm, almost weightless, and yet it seemed to carry the full measure of a threshold. She had no plan that would satisfy a sensible person, no car, no tools, no bedroll beyond the thin blanket rolled in her duffel, no knowledge of county deeds except that papers made some people powerful and others removable, but she knew rope walks were long because work sometimes needed room. She knew abandoned places were not always empty. She knew $5 could not buy safety, but it might buy a door through which rain had not yet learned her name. At 3:28, Callie stood. She refolded the bill along its old creases and tucked the rope gauge back into her coat. She tightened the duffel strap across her shoulder, thanked the librarian for the warmth without making a ceremony of it, and stepped again into the coastal rain. The annex lay 6 blocks away through streets shining with water, past a closed bait shop, a diner with fogged windows, and a hardware store whose front display held storm lanterns, stovepipe, and work gloves arranged by size. At the corner, wind lifted the edge of the yellow notice in her hand and snapped it once like a small sail. Callie held it carefully and kept walking, not toward rescue, not toward fortune, but toward a forgotten building where old hemp dust still waited in the cracks, and a sealed twisting post had kept its silence through every winter since before she was born. The southbound bus left before daylight, carrying 3 passengers, 2 paper sacks of groceries, and a driver who kept one hand high on the wheel as if steering by touch more than sight. Callie sat midway back, with the duffel pressed between her boots and the black contractor bag folded inside it now because the seams had begun to split. The heater under the seat breathed out dust and damp metal. Rain moved across the windows in long diagonal lines, blurring the roadside into alder trunks, mailboxes, and the occasional pale shape of a horse standing with its head lowered in a field. She had slept only in pieces the night before, folded into the lee of a closed thrift store with cardboard beneath her hip and her coat pulled over her ears. Every time a car slowed, her body woke before her eyes did. By morning she had a headache at the base of her skull, and her fingers smelled faintly of wet wool from holding the rope gauge through the lining of her pocket. The bus fare took almost everything not already committed to the folded bill. She counted the remaining change twice before handing it over. The driver watched the coins drop into the tray and then looked at her face for less than a second. "Cold one," he said. "Yes, sir." "Supposed to clear by noon." She nodded. Though the sky had no intention of clearing, it hung low and pewter-coloured over Highway 101, pressing the spruce tops into black strokes against the morning. The bus rolled past cranberry bogs, past closed fruit stands, past narrow bridges where water hurried beneath without showing its bottom. Once near Sixes, the driver slowed for elk crossing the road. They emerged from fog without hurry, heavy-bodied and exact, their coats darkened by rain. No one spoke until the last cow climbed the bank and vanished into Salal. The bus went only as far as Port Orford proper. From there the clerk's annex, the ad had said, sat closer to the old harbour road, and the parcel itself lay nearly 4 miles beyond town, toward a low area of scrub pasture and alder brake where the historic utility lanes no longer appeared on most county maps. Callie had copied directions from a librarian's atlas before leaving. 6 blocks to the annex first, then north by foot if the deed became real, past Coast Guard Hill Road, west on an old service lane, then beyond a turnoff no longer marked except by a leaning cedar post. She arrived in town under a sky still threatening weather. The air measured 41 degrees on the bank sign, though the wind made it feel less honest than that. She had no gloves, so she tucked her hands under the duffel strap and walked with her shoulders lifted. By the time she reached the annex, her socks were damp again, but her feet were not yet numb. Port Orford was awake in a careful coastal way. A diner called Blue Gull Cafe had steam clouding its front windows and a chalkboard promising clam chowder after 11. Beside it stood Madson's Hardware, narrow-fronted and weathered with fishing knives, lantern mantles, stove rope gasket and rubber boots arranged behind glass. Farther down was a shuttered bait shop painted the colour of old cream, a thrift store with quilts hanging from a pipe rack, and a post office where 2 men in rain jackets spoke near the flagpole with the solemnity of farmers judging a field. There was also a laundromat called Spin Harbour, a feed and seed supply with sacks stacked beneath an awning, and a tiny insurance office whose window displayed a plastic fern and a calendar still turned to August. Everything looked as if it had survived by narrowing its needs. Callie paused outside the cafe long enough to smell bacon and coffee, then kept walking. Hunger could become a kind of weather if a person stopped arguing with it. She had learnt that in the previous weeks. It rose, pressed, faded, returned. It did not deserve every answer. The Curry County Clerk Annex occupied the front half of a low concrete building shared with a marine surveyor and a tax preparation office that opened only 3 days a week. A ramp led to a glass door with a metal handle polished bright by many hands. Inside, the room was warmer than the street and smelled of copier toner, damp coats, floor wax, and the faint vanilla scent of an electric plug-in warmer hidden somewhere behind the counter. There were 3 chairs against one wall, a rack of county brochures, a corkboard with notices about burn permits and winter road closures, and a high counter separating the public from file cabinets, stacked forms and 2 desks. A bell sat near a plastic tray labelled completed documents. Callie did not ring it. She stood with the yellow notice in both hands until a woman at the farther desk finished writing in a ledger and looked up over her glasses. The woman was perhaps in her late 60s, compact and straight-backed, with silver hair wound into a coil at the base of her head. Her cardigan was the colour of oatmeal, buttoned to the throat, and she wore a narrow gold watch that slid down her wrist when she reached for papers. On the counter before her sat a nameplate, Mrs. Lenora Voss, Deputy Clerk. Yes? Callie stepped forward. The soles of her shoes made soft wet marks on the linoleum. I came about the surplus notice. Mrs. Voss held out one hand, not impatiently, but as if time belonged to the county and she had agreed to administer it. Callie gave her the paper. The clerk read it, turned it over, noted the grocery receipt on the back with the copied address, and then read the front again. The rope walk parcel, yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Voss set the notice flat on the counter and looked at Callie more carefully. It was not the sharp look Warren used, the one that measured weakness for leverage. It was a practical look, concerned with facts. Wet hair. Young face. Thin coat. Duffel. No ring. No umbrella. $5. Perhaps, and less besides. You understand, this is not a residence. Yes. Ma'am. It has no inspected electrical service. Yes. Ma'am. No county water. Yes. Ma'am. The roof is compromised. Yes. Ma'am. There is an active condemnation file. Callie swallowed once. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Voss removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The office printer clicked, warmed, and fell silent. Outside, A truck passed through standing water, sending a long hiss across the street. You also understand, the clerk said, that a purchase transfers responsibility. The county is not selling you shelter. It is disposing of a burden. Yes, ma'am. That means if a wall falls, it falls on your account. Yes, ma'am. If there are liens, you address them. Yes, ma'am. If the demolition order proceeds and you have not filed a repair plan, you may lose it anyway. Callie looked down at the yellow notice. The paper had softened from rain and handling. The typed words blurred slightly near the bottom, but the price remained legible. I understand, Mrs. Voss studied her for another moment, then opened a drawer and took out a brown folder tied with cotton tape. The folder seemed too thin to hold anything as heavy as land. She loosened the tape, removed several forms, and placed them in order on the counter. Name, Callie Mae Whitaker. The pen in Mrs. Voss's hand stopped, only for a second. Then it continued, neat and deliberate, forming the letters on a carbon copy intake sheet. Date of birth. Callie gave it. Current mailing address. There it was, the first empty place on a government form that could not be crossed by wanting. Callie felt heat rise in her face, though the room was not overly warm. Mrs. Voss waited without rescuing her. I don't have one right now. The clerk did not ask why. She drew a line through the field, wrote temporary general delivery requested, and moved on. Identification. Callie pulled her state ID from the cloth pouch inside her coat. The clerk examined it, compared the face, copied the number, and slid it back. The minimum claim is $5, certified or cash. Callie brought out the bill. For a moment she could not make her fingers open. The money had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease had become soft as fabric. She placed it on the counter. Mrs. Voss smoothed it once with the side of her hand, not because it needed smoothing, but because she seemed to understand that some money had travelled hard. From another drawer came the deed papers, a receipt book, a county hazard acknowledgement, and a single-page repair compliance notice printed in red at the top. Mrs. Voss explained each one. Callie listened the way Amos had taught her to listen in the workshop, with her eyes steady and her hands still. She signed where the clerk marked an X. Her signature looked too young on those documents. The C uncertain, the W uneven, but it was hers. When Mrs. Voss reached for the brass stamp, Callie noticed how old it was. Not decorative, not kept for charm. It was heavy and darkened by use, with a curved handle worn smooth where decades of clerks had pressed authority into paper. Mrs. Voss placed the deed beneath it, aligned the corner against a metal guide, and brought the stamp down. The sound filled the room. Not loud, but final. A seal rose from the page in raised fibers and shadow. County of Curry, State of Oregon, recorded, transferred, filed. Mrs. Voss wrote a receipt by hand, tore it along the perforation, and slid it toward Callie with the deed packet and a photocopied map. The $5 bill disappeared into a drawer divided by metal clips. For reasons Callie could not have named, she watched where it went. Third slot from the left, beneath a roll of quarters and above a paper band of ones. Directions, Mrs. Voss said, taking a pencil. You will leave town on the north side. Follow Oregon Street until it meets the Old Harbor Road, then keep west when the pavement narrows. Do not take the first gravel drive, that belongs to the Mickelsons, and their dog has poor judgment. Take the second track past the walnut trees. There used to be a sign. It may be down. Callie folded the map carefully. Thank you. Mrs. Voss did not release the top page right away. Whitaker, she said. Callie looked up. Your family from around Gold Beach once? My grandfather was Amos Whitaker. The clerk's hand remained on the paper. Her face changed. Not much, but enough. The formal lines around her mouth eased into something older than office work. Amos with the rope hands? Callie did not answer. She had not heard anyone say his name that way since the funeral. Mrs. Voss leaned back a little. My father fished out of Port Orford in the 70s. He brought lines to Amos when nobody else could repair them right. Said he could splice rope cleaner than most women braid hair. Callie lowered her eyes to the deed packet because the room had become unsteady in a manner she refused to show. He taught me a little. I expect he taught you more than a little. The clerk opened another drawer and removed a plain envelope. She wrote the parcel number on it, then added her own phone extension beneath. You will need to file a stabilization plan within 30 days if you mean to keep the demolition office patient. It does not need to be elegant. Roof first, then wall bracing, then chimney inspection, if you intend to burn anything. I don't have a phone. Mrs. Voss paused, then wrote the library number beside her own. Leave messages through the library if you must. They know how to reach this desk. Callie nodded. The clerk pushed the papers fully into her hands. Miss Whitaker. Yes. Ma'am. Do not sleep under a failing roof if wind comes from the west. Callie tucked the deed packet inside her coat, flat against her ribs. No, ma'am. And if you find anything that looks like county records, maritime documents, or hazardous waste, you bring word here before touching more than you must. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Voss put her glasses back on. The office regained its shape around them. Cabinets, counter, copier, rain light, clock. But something had been altered, not in the county records alone. A name had crossed from one life into another, and had not been turned away. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that held close to the ground. Callie stood under the annex awning and opened the map again. Her stomach ached with hunger, but the feeling was distant now, like surf heard from behind a wall. She had a deed in her coat. A deed did not make a place livable. It did not put soup in a pot. It did not repair rafters or make walls upright. Still, it was a paper that said no one could order her off that ground without first taking the trouble to write her name. She began walking north. The town fell away in layers. First the cafe and hardware store, then the laundromat, then the last cluster of houses with crab pots stacked beside garages. A woman carrying mail lifted one hand from across the street. Callie returned the gesture, uncertain whether it had been meant for her. The sidewalk ended near a drainage ditch. After that she walked to the shoulder, where wet grass brushed her ankles and passing trucks pushed cold air against her coat. The route climbed gently past Coast Guard Hill Road, then bent toward lower ground. On her right stood a line of alders with pale trunks freckled dark by rain. On her left were modest houses set back behind wire fencing, some with boats under tarps and wood smoke rising from metal chimneys. She passed a mailbox shaped like a salmon, a collapsed shed with a blue tarp roof, a pasture where 3 sheep stood under a fir tree, each one as still as if carved from weathered wool. At the first gravel drive, a large brown dog came out from behind a pickup and announced himself with conviction. He did not cross the cattle guard, but his bark followed Callie until the road curved. She remembered Mrs. Voss's warning and kept walking without turning her head. Poor judgment, the clerk had said, and the phrase nearly brought a smile to her mouth. Past the dog's place, the land widened. Blackberry canes thickened along the ditches. The smell of the ocean came and went, not clean exactly, but alive. Kelp, salt, mud, and distant rot. Walnut trees appeared where the map said they would, 6 of them in a row, their leaves mostly gone, their black limbs lifting against the dull sky. The second track lay just beyond them, half hidden under grass and matted fir needles. A cedar post leaned at the entrance, and nailed to it, face down, was a plank that might once have been a sign. Callie stopped there. The track was not long, perhaps a 1/4 mile, but it had grown into itself. Grass pushed through the centre, wheel ruts held brown water, salmonberry arched over the edges. She could see only the first bend, where alder branches met overhead, and made a tunnel of wet twigs. The deed packet beneath her coat felt suddenly thin. She shifted the duffel higher and went in. Every step made a sound, mud pulling at her soles, rainwater shaken from leaves, the tick of unseen branches settling after she passed. Somewhere to her left, water moved through a culvert or ditch, not loudly, but with the steady voice of a thing that knew its way downhill. She had walked many roads in the last weeks. This one felt less like a road than a test of whether she meant what her signature had said. At the bend, the trees opened. The rope walk stood in a long clearing, set parallel to the slope as if it had been laid down by someone measuring distance with work in mind. It was longer than a cottage, narrower than a barn, and stranger than either. The main building stretched perhaps 80 feet from end to end, framed in aged cedar and fir, with plank siding silvered by weather and patched in places with mismatched boards. The roof ran low and straight for most of its length, though the western third sagged visibly between rafters. Moss had taken hold along the north slope. One brick chimney rose near the front room, leaning slightly but not yet fallen. At the near end, a small square room projected from the long work hall, with 2 windows facing the track and a door beneath a simple shed awning. Beyond it, the rope walk extended like a covered lane, its narrow windows placed high along the south wall to admit light without letting rain reach the working floor. An old sign hung crooked from 2 rusted chains above the door. Most of the paint had gone, but Callie could still make out the ghost of letters: Whitaker and Sons, cordage, hemp, line, net repair. The sight stopped her breath. Not because of the name, not only that. Names could remain on buildings after everyone who earned them was gone. What stilled her was the particular modesty of the place. It had not been built to impress the road. It had no porch meant for sitting, no trim beyond what kept water out, no gesture toward beauty except proportion and use. It was a working length of shelter, a place for walking backward with fibre in hand. The front step had split down the middle. A fern grew from the crack. Callie approached carefully. The door was swollen in its frame, and the old iron latch resisted until she lifted and pressed at the same time. The hinges complained, a dry sound despite the damp air. When the door opened, the smell came first. Dust, cold ashes, mouse nests, cedar, mildew, old fibre, rust, the faint mineral breath of rain that had found its way through roof and wall and had been sitting in the dark with no one to ask it to leave. She stood on the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room had once served as office, warming room, and perhaps living space in hard seasons. A pot-bellied stove sat near the chimney, dull with surface rust, its pipe disconnected and resting at an angle like a tired arm. Beside one wall stood a table with one drawer missing. A wooden chair lay on its side beneath a grey net of cobweb. Shelves held ledger books swollen by damp, a broken lantern, 2 chipped mugs, and a row of empty glass jars with metal lids bloomed white from age. The floorboards were wide, uneven, and littered with leaves blown under the door. There were sounds inside the silence. Water dripping somewhere beyond the wall. A mouse moving in the ceiling. The soft hiss of wind pressing through gaps and finding the high notes. Callie stepped in. The air was colder than outside. She crossed to the stove but did not touch it. Amos had warned her about old chimneys. A fire could save or kill depending on whether a flue had been kept honest. She looked instead at the table, the shelves, the window where the glass had cracked in one corner but still held. The front room was not safe, it was not welcoming in the easy sense, yet it had walls. It had a door that closed after effort. It had a floor she could sweep. Beyond the front room, a wide interior doorway opened into the long work hall. There the building became itself. The hall extended into dimness, narrow and patient, with a plank walkway worn down the centre by feet long absent. Along the far end she could see the shapes of hooks mounted on an iron head, some bent, some intact. On the opposite end stood the twisting post, taller than a man, blackened with age and oil, its wheel and pegs still in place beneath dust. Strands of ancient fibre hung in places from rafters like pale hair. A broken rack leaned against the wall. A wooden trough lay overturned. High windows admitted a thin grey light that settled along the floor in bars. Callie did not enter the full length at once. She stood at the threshold and listened. Rain on the roof, drip in a pan or pail somewhere unseen, wind moving along the siding, her own breathing, too quick at first, then slower. The place felt abandoned, but not empty. She returned to the front room before dusk and began making it smaller. That was something she knew how to do. When a whole life could not be handled, a corner sometimes could. She set the duffel on the table after testing its legs. She cleared leaves and mouse droppings from the area farthest from the chimney. She used a broken board as a scraper and pushed debris toward the door. In one cabinet she found a rusted flour tin, empty except for a dead moth and a folded paper label. In another, a stack of newspapers from 1984, yellowed but dry enough in the middle to use beneath her blanket. There was an outhouse visible from the back door, leaning but upright. There was a hand pump near a concrete pad, though she did not trust it yet. There was a roof that sagged, a wall that leaned, a chimney untested, and no food except half a heel of bread wrapped in a napkin in her bag. She ate it slowly near the window while the day closed down over the clearing. As darkness gathered, the building changed. The work hall became a deeper shape beyond the doorway. The front room held what little light remained and then gave it up. Callie found the emergency candle the librarian had slipped into her hand without comment when she left the library. She had almost forgotten it. It was short, white, and slightly bent, wrapped in a paper towel with 2 wooden matches. She set it in one of the chipped mugs, struck a match against the underside of the table, and watched the flame take. The candle did not make the room bright. It made the dark visible. She spread the newspapers first, then her thin blanket, then the spare sweater folded as a pillow. The floor sent cold through every layer. She kept her coat on and her shoes near her hand. The duffel strap went around her wrist from habit. Above her the roof ticked and shifted in the cooling air. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse resumed its careful work. She did not pray in words. Words had become difficult around asking, but she placed the brass rope gauge beside the candle and rested 2 fingers on it until the metal warmed slightly beneath her skin. She remembered Amos sweeping before beginning. She remembered Mrs. Voss saying his name. She remembered the $5 bill entering the drawer and the sound of the brass stamp making a paper into a threshold. After a long while, rain began again. Not hard. Just enough to speak over the roof and gather at the broken gutter outside the window. Callie lay still and watched the candle shorten, its flame bending each time wind found a seam in the room. The house had been waiting, and so had she. By morning, the candle had burned down into a white cup of wax, and the first work of the place announced itself without ceremony. Water had gathered overnight in a shallow pan of floor where the front room sagged toward the north wall. It had come through the roof in 3 separate drops, each one patient, each one exact, falling from darkened seams between ceiling boards. Callie woke to the sound of them before she understood where she was. One drop struck a newspaper near her shoulder, another fell into the empty flour tin she had moved beneath a stain. The third tapped the plank floor with the small persistence of a clock. She sat up slowly, every joint stiff from cold, and let the room return to her in pieces. The stove, the table, the swollen ledger books, the broken chair, the grey morning at the cracked window, the deed packet tucked inside her coat, creased but dry. For 3 days she did not attempt anything grand. She learned the limits of the building the way a person learns the habits of an animal that may or may not allow touch. The front step would bear weight if she kept to the left. The third board inside the door sighed but did not bend. The loose board near the stove shifted under her heel and had to be avoided in darkness. In the long hall the centre path held, but the edges near the north wall softened where rain had travelled down behind the siding and entered the floor grain by grain. The hand pump behind the building gave no water the first day. Its handle rose and fell with a hollow clank. and the spout coughed only rust-coloured flakes. Callie worked it in sets of 20, resting between, listening for any change below ground. On the second afternoon it groaned, spat brown water, and then stopped. She found an old bucket in the back room, washed it with rainwater, and primed the pump from a ditch pool after straining the water through a handkerchief. On the third try, the pump answered with a thin, cold stream that smelled of iron and earth. She did not drink it. Not yet. She filled the bucket, let the water settle, and used it for washing the table, her hands, and the worst of the floor. For drinking, she walked back toward town with 2 empty jars found on the shelf, filled them at the library restroom, and carried them home in the duffel, wrapped in shirts so they would not knock together. Water became heavy after the first mile. It made her aware of every slope in the road. The outhouse stood 12 paces beyond the back door beneath a crabapple tree nearly stripped of leaves. Its roof had held better than the main building, but the door hung crooked, and the latch had been replaced at some point with baling wire. Inside was cold wood, a swallow nest abandoned under the eave, and a Sears catalogue from a year before Callie's birth, swollen but still readable in the middle. She scrubbed what she could, spread lime she found in a sealed coffee can, and left the door open to air during the day. Nights were the hardest, not because of fear alone, but because darkness returned the building to its own memory. In the day she could assign tasks to what she saw, sweep this, lift that, avoid there. At night the rope walk lengthened beyond its walls, the high windows became black pieces of water, the hooks at the far end of the work hall caught the dim candlelight, and seemed to have been waiting with their curved iron fingers raised. Callie slept in her coat, with the rope gauge under her palm, and woke often. By the 4th morning, she knew she needed 3 things before anything else: a safe way to make heat, a plan the county might accept, and some manner of credit, even if only enough for nails and stovepipe. Pride had to wait outside. Pride did not keep rain from rafters. She walked into town after rinsing her face in pump water and pinning her damp hair at the back of her neck with 2 bobby pins found in the duffel lining. The road had begun to recognize her feet. The dog at the first gravel drive barked as before, but with less conviction. At the walnut trees she paused once, looking back toward the track, then kept on. Madson's hardware smelled like a place that did not waste language. Iron-oiled wood, burlap, kerosene, new rope, seed potatoes, rubber boots, and coffee, gone bitter on a hot plate near the register. The aisles were narrow and high, with bins of screws arranged by size, drawers labelled in black marker, stove parts stacked behind the counter, and hand tools hanging in orderly rows under dust that no one seemed ashamed of. A bell above the door gave one tired ring when Callie entered. The man behind the counter was tall and narrow, with a white moustache cut blunt across his lip and eyebrows so pale they nearly disappeared against his weathered skin. He wore a red flannel shirt beneath a canvas vest, and his hands were marked by small healed cuts. The kind a person gets from living among metal edges and not complaining about them. A tape measure hung from his belt. His name was stitched in faded blue thread above his shirt pocket. Harlan. He looked at Callie, then at her boots, then at the damp hem of her coat. "You are the Whitaker girl." Callie stopped near a barrel of axe handles. "I suppose I am." Lenora called. It did not surprise her exactly. In a town like that, papers moved by hand, but news travelled by breath. Harlan reached beneath the counter and brought up a ledger book thick enough to hold several winters. He opened it with one finger marking a page. "You need roof patch, stove pipe, nails, and a chimney brush before you need anything pretty." "I do not have money for pretty." "Good. Pretty costs more and holds less." His voice had no softness in it, but neither did it carry mockery. Callie stepped closer. Behind him, shelves held lantern wicks, gasket cement, plumber's strap, mason line, wood glue, copper pipe fittings, and tins of putty hardened around their rims. A coal-black stove sat in the corner with a handwritten tag. "Not for sale, do not ask." "I can pay a little," she said. "Not today. I can work. Sweep. Stock shelves. Clean. Harlan lowered his eyes to the ledger. I do not need a clerk. She nodded once, accepting the sentence before it could bruise. But I have carried your grandfather's account in this book since 1974, he added. He died owing me $12.18. I never collected because he repaired my crab line after I told him not to bother. That line held through a January gale and kept my brother from cutting loose 200 feet of gear. Callie did not know what to do with that kind of accounting. Harlan turned the ledger around. At the bottom of an old page, in brown ink, was Amos Whitaker's name, not the formal name from the deed. Amos W. Rope and line. Beside it, in a different hand, were small charges from years before, tarred twine, awl blade, beeswax, copper, tacks, coffee. I cannot extend much, Harlan said. $35 to start. You bring receipts of work, not stories. You miss payments. I stop. Yes, sir. You burn that place down. Do not come here asking for sympathy. No, sir. He took a pencil from behind his ear. Say what you came for. Callie laid both hands on the counter so he would not see them shake. I need to clean the chimney before I use the stove. I need to keep rain from the worst part of the roof. I need to write a repair plan for the county. I need to know what I do not know. For the first time, Harlan's mouth moved almost toward approval. That last one is useful. He began gathering things with spare, practiced motions. A 6-inch round chimney brush with black poly bristles, 2 4-foot fiberglass rods from a rack, a small wire hand brush, a flat scraper, a dust mask, a roll of black stovepipe tape rated for heat, a packet of 3/8-inch rope gasket, a half-pound of 8D galvanized nails, a sheet of 6mm plastic folded tight, a blue tarp too stiff from storage to open easily, a coil of mason's line, 2 pairs of brown cotton work gloves, which he tossed onto the pile without writing down until Callie noticed. I did not ask for gloves. I noticed. I cannot pay for those. I did not hear you ask. He wrote anyway. But when he added the column, he left the gloves out. Then he reached beneath the counter again and brought up a paperback book with a cracked spine and a cover showing a man in high-waisted jeans repairing a porch roof. The county used to give these out after the 96 storms, he said. Basic rural home repair. Most of it is plain enough. Ignore the electrical chapter unless you want to meet your maker early. Callie took it as if it were a more delicate object than it was. Thank you. Do not thank paper. Read it. He tore a sheet from an invoice pad and wrote each item with a price in the same blunt hand. Chimney brush. 6-inch, 8 on $75 used. Fiberglass rod sections. 2, $5. Wire brush. $2.10. Flat scraper. 1.50 cents. Dust mask. $1.25. Heat tape. $3.40. Stove rope gasket. $4.85. 8D galvanized nails. Half-pound. $2.60. 6mm plastic remnant. $3. Blue tarp. Weathered stock. $4. Mason line. $1.95. Total. 38.40 cents. He stared at the total, then drew a line through the tarp price and wrote $1. $35.40. That is still over. Your grandfather can cover 40 cents from the $12.18 I never collected. Callie looked at him then. He did not smile. He had already closed the ledger and was tying the rods together with twine. Bring the brush back in one piece, he said. Yes, sir. And clean from the top if you can get there safely. If you cannot, clean from below and accept soot in your teeth. Close off the room. Wear the mask. Lay wet cloth if you have it. Creosote flakes burn hotter than you think. I understand. No, you do not. "But you may after." She carried the supplies out under one arm and the paperback tucked beneath her coat, feeling the shape of a new debt settle beside the deed. It was not a pleasant feeling. It was better than helplessness. The chimney took 7 hours. Not 7 hours of continuous heroic work, but 7 hours counted in coughing, resting, climbing, reconsidering, sweeping, and beginning again. Callie started by removing the old stovepipe where it had come loose from the thimble. The pipe was lighter than it looked because rust had eaten portions thin as paper. When she lifted it, black flakes spilled from the elbow and struck the floor like burnt leaves. She set it outside under the awning and carried the stove away from the wall by rocking it 1 iron foot at a time. She hung the 6mm plastic across the doorway to the long hall, using nails already in the trim and strips torn from an old sheet. Around the stove opening she spread damp newspaper and a towel sacrificed from the duffel. The dust mask smelled of cardboard and rubber. It did not seal well, but it was something. From below she pushed the brush up through the flue in sections. At first it would not move past the first bend. She worked it with short strokes, twisting clockwise, then pulling down just enough to loosen the packed creosote. The first fall came suddenly. A hard black shower into the fireplace throat and across her sleeve. It smelled sharp, tarry and old, not like wood smoke, which carried memory and weather, but like chimney neglect made solid. She coughed until her eyes watered. Then she kept going. The flue narrowed near shoulder height where a nest had lodged and partly collapsed. She drew down twigs, soot, feathers, and one long strip of cloth so brittle it broke when touched. She used the flat scraper along the accessible edges, then the wire brush, then the chimney brush again, adding the second rod and feeling for resistance. Each time the brush rose higher, a different sound came through the brick. Scrape, hush, scrape, fall. At noon she stopped and sat on the front step with soot streaked across her cheek and both hands blackened through the gloves. The sky had cleared enough to show a pale seam of blue beyond the trees. She drank water from the jar and ate nothing because there was nothing left to eat. Hunger sharpened the smell of every house down the road where lunch might be happening. After resting, she took the ladder she had found behind the work hall, tested each rung, rejected it, then dragged a shorter orchard ladder from the blackberry edge and tested that instead. It was weathered but less rotten. She set it against the low roof near the front room, climbed 3 rungs, climbed down, adjusted the feet, climbed again. At the roofline she could reach the chimney cap by lying on her stomach across wet moss and bracing one boot against a cedar shake that shifted beneath pressure. There was no cap left, only a rusted screen and a stone lodged across part of the opening. She removed the stone, worked the brush down from above, and felt the flue clear in small definite collapses. Soot rose in bitter puffs and drifted across the roof. When the brush finally passed freely from top to bottom, she lay still for several seconds, cheek against cold moss, listening to her own breath. By late afternoon she had swept 3 dustpans full of creosote, nest matter, and soot into a rusted pail. She cleaned the stove's firebox with the wire brush, cleared the ash grate, checked the seams with her fingertips, and replaced the rotten door gasket with the new rope, pressing it carefully into the groove with the handle of the pocket knife. She reattached the least ruined section of stovepipe using heat tape at the joint and a strip of plumber's strap she found nailed to a shelf. It was not beautiful. It was better. Before lighting anything, she held a twist of newspaper near the open stove door and watched the smoke from a match. It pulled inward, weakly at first, then steadily. The chimney had draught. She waited another half-hour anyway. At dusk she built the first fire with shavings from broken cedar kindling, 2 dry sticks found behind the stove, and a careful scrap of newspaper. She used 1 match, the flame took low and blue, then yellow, then entered the cedar with a sound like paper being breathed upon. She did not close the stove door until the draught had proven itself. Smoke trembled, considered the room, then went upward where it belonged. The heat came slowly. It touched the stove's sides first, then the air near her knees, then the room in widening degrees. Callie sat on the floor in front of it with both hands extended. watching rust-dark iron change from dead metal to labouring presence. The smell of old stove warming was sharp, dusty, and almost bitter. She opened the door once to let it pass, then closed it when the room began to cool. Her first hot meal in the rope walk was made in a dented enamel pot she found on the back shelf and scrubbed with sand until the inside looked usable. Harlan had added, without mentioning it, a packet of lentils and 2 bouillon cubes to her supply bag. She discovered them only when she unfolded the tarp. She cooked the lentils too long in pump water. She boiled hard for 10 minutes, then added the bouillon and a pinch of salt from a paper packet saved from a diner counter. She ate sitting on the floor, with the pot wrapped in a towel between her knees. No meal had ever tasted more exact. The next day she began inventory. Not searching. Inventory. Searching was hungry work, full of wanting. Inventory was patient. It belonged to people who meant to stay. Callie tore blank margins from the county packet envelope and used the pencil from the library to make columns: room, object, condition, possible use. The front room gave up its list first: 1 pot-bellied stove, usable with caution, 1 table, repairable, 1 chair, broken stretcher, 3 ledger books, damp, do not open until dry, 8 glass jars, lids rusted, 1 kerosene lantern, cracked chimney, 2 mugs, 1 enamel pot, 1 flour tin, 1 wall shelf loose at left bracket, 1 broom handle without broom. The back room required more light. She waited until noon, when the high windows admitted the strongest greyness, then entered the long hall with the candle stub, though she did not light it. Daylight was safer for seeing the floor. She moved along the centre path and let her eyes sort shape from shadow. The hall held the remains of a trade laid down in place, as if the last worker had expected to return after dinner and never did. On the south wall, mounted pegs held hanks of fibre tied with cotton string, too brittle now for use but still labelled in ink: Italian hemp, Kentucky hemp, flax tow, sail twine, binder cord. Beneath them stood a low bench with a groove worn into its front edge by decades of work. A serving mallet lay under it, cracked through the handle but whole at the head. There were 3 wooden fids, 2 marlin spikes, 1 iron and 1 bone, a pair of shears frozen shut with rust, and a box of copper tacks turned green in their paper wrapping. Farther down she found a stretching rack, 1 leg broken, a barrel half full of dust and mouse-chewed fibre, a hand-cranked winder missing its belt, 2 wooden reels, 1 split along the grain, a bundle of long slats, maybe for repairing the walk frame, coils of rope too far gone to trust but useful for learning pattern and lay, a tin marked Stockholm tar sealed and heavy, a small scale with brass weights wrapped in cloth, a chalk-line reel, a wooden gauge larger than Amos's, notched by hand and darkened where thumbs had held it. At the far end, the iron hooks were mounted in a rotating head, fixed to the wall. Some had rusted into place. Others still moved when she touched them, reluctantly, as if waking with a complaint. Opposite them, near the front end but inside the work hall, stood the twisting post. It was more substantial than she had first understood. The post rose from floor to ceiling, squared from a single heavy timber, perhaps cedar heartwood, with a wheel set at shoulder height and 3 smaller pegs arranged below, dark oil stains marked where hands had worked. The base was braced with 2 angled supports bolted through the floor. Around the lower portion, a circular collar of wood had been fitted, worn smooth at the front and darker at the back where dust had gathered undisturbed. Callie wrote, "Twisting post. Intact. Inspect later." Then she stopped. Later was a word people used when they were avoiding the exact thing their hand had already noticed. The post did not sound like the rest of the building. She had begun tapping objects without thinking much of it, a habit learned from Amos and from motel cleaning, where a loose tile, hollow door or cracked leg could be known by knuckle before sight. The workbench gave a flat wooden knock, the reels gave a dry ring. The floorboards answered differently depending on rot, support, and air beneath. The twisting post, when tapped near the upper wheel, gave back the dense, dull sound of solid timber. Near the middle, the same. At the lower collar, however, Beneath the worn front face, the sound changed. Not hollow exactly. Reserved. She tapped again, this time with the handle of the pocket knife. The note was lower than it should have been and faintly delayed. She pressed her palm to the wood. The collar did not move. She crouched, brushed away dust, and examined the seam where the circular fitted piece met the square post. There were no visible hinges, no pull ring, no keyhole, only grain darkened by oil and time. She moved to the opposite side where the light was poorer. There, near the back of the collar, she found 3 small plugs set into the wood in a triangular pattern. They were darker than the surrounding grain, cedar perhaps, but end-cut and carefully flush. At first they looked like knots. Then she saw the tool marks around them, fine as eyelashes. Weight test came next. She did not know what she expected, only that the post's lower half carried something not accounted for by timber alone. She tried to lift the collar. Nothing. She pushed. Nothing. She set both hands against one brace and shifted her weight. The post did not move, but from within came a faint settling sound, not the scurry of mice, not the fall of dust. Something inside had answered gravity after a long silence. Callie went back to the front room and sat by the stove without lighting it. There are discoveries a person should not hurry toward. Hunger hurries, fear hurries, greed hurries most of all, but an old hiding place deserved the courtesy of deliberate hands. She drank water, washed soot from under her nails, and opened Harlan's repair book to a chapter on hidden rot around posts and sills. She read 3 pages without taking in a word. Then she closed the book and returned with the candle, the wire brush, the pocket knife, and the small flat scraper. The first cedar plug came free after 20 minutes. She did not pry hard. Amos had taught her that old wood punished arrogance. She cleaned the rim with the knife tip, brushed dust from the grain, and pressed gently from one side until the plug lifted enough to catch. It came out whole, a tapered disc no larger than a nickel, smelling faintly of cedar when she held it close. Behind it was a narrow dark hole. The second plug resisted longer. The third nearly split, and she stopped twice to steady her hands. When all 3 lay in her palm, she saw that each had been marked on the back with a tiny knife cut. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines. They were meant to return to their own places. Behind the plugs were recessed screws, old slotted heads black with age but not ruined. She fetched the iron marlinspike, rejected it as too broad, then found a screwdriver in the tool drawer with a worn wooden handle and a tip ground thin. The first screw turned with a dry crack that made her flinch. The second came easier. The third brought with it a little fall of dust from inside the collar. When she removed the last screw, nothing opened. She waited, hand on the wood. Then, under slight pressure from her thumb, the front portion of the collar shifted outward by less than an inch. The compartment had swollen with years. She worked the seam slowly, using the scraper not to pry but to persuade. A line appeared where none had seemed to be. The curved face of the collar came away as a hidden door, thick, cedar-backed, and heavier than expected. Inside was a cavity cut into the lower post, dark and dry. Callie held the candle near but not inside. The first thing she saw was cloth. Not a heap, not refuse. Packages, wrapped and tied. 3 long bundles in waxed canvas, 1 square bundle in oilcloth, a small tin box, a roll of paper bound with twine, a folded leather pouch hardened with age. Behind them, set upright, was a journal with a dark brown cover and a strap closure gone fragile at the bend. She did not touch anything for a full minute. The hidden space smelled different from the rest of the hall. Dry cedar, old cloth, iron. A faint sweetness like paper kept away from weather. It was the smell of being spared. She removed the bundles one at a time and laid them on the workbench in the order found. The long waxed canvas roll contained tools, a serving mallet with a head worn smooth by use but not cracked, 3 polished wooden fids nested by size, an awl, a sailor's palm, a bundle of needles in greased paper, and a small brass gauge nearly twin to Amos's but older. its markings hand-stamped and uneven. The second bundle held raw material, combed hemp line, pale gold and still sound where the inner layers had been protected. The third held skeins of fine twine, black tarred marline, and linen thread wound around cards. The oilcloth bundle contained papers. She did not open them yet beyond confirming they were dry. The rolled paper seemed to be a diagram perhaps of the mechanism. The leather pouch held 3 coins, not the cash, only keepsakes, an Indian head cent, a worn silver dime, and a brass trade token from a chandlery in Astoria. The tin box was heavier than its size allowed. It had been sealed around the lid with wax darkened to brown. Callie sat on the bench before opening it. Not because she guessed what was inside, but because the weight had the grave feel of something counted and meant. The wax cracked under the pocket knife. The lid lifted with a slight gasp as old air gave way. Inside were packets of money wrapped in paper bands, a cloth sack of coins, and a small medal lying on top as if keeping watch. The bills were old, some large-sized notes folded carefully, some silver certificates, some later currency from the 1930s and 1940s. The paper bands had figures written in ink. Callie did not trust them. She cleared a place on the bench, washed her hands again, dried them on her coat lining, and began to count. She counted once quickly, then again slowly, then a third time after sorting by denomination. There were $20 bills, $10 bills, 5s, 2s and 1s. There were silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, dimes, nickels and cents wrapped in cloth rolls. The coin sack held Morgan dollars from 1889, 1896 and 1901, piece dollars from 1922 and 1093 Barber, half-dollars worn nearly smooth, mercury dimes, buffalo nickels with some dates rubbed away, and wheat cents dark as fallen leaves. One small envelope contained 3 gold coins, each wrapped separately in tissue, a $5 half eagle from 1908, another from 1911, and one from 1914, its edge nicked but still clear. The total, when she finished, was $32,505.74. She wrote it on the back of an invoice, then stared at the number until it lost meaning and became marks. $32,505.74. Not fortune in the way TV meant fortune. Not mansion money. Not a life without work. But roof money. Winter money. County patience money. Enough to buy time, if spent with care. Enough to make the difference between a condemned place and a place under repair. Her hands did not shake until she tried to return the coins to their cloth. The medal was brass and darkened, hanging from a faded ribbon. On one side was an eagle with wings lifted, on the other, worn but readable, were the words Spanish War Service, 1898. The ribbon had once been red and yellow but had faded toward brown. Tucked beneath it was a narrow slip of paper with a name written in the same careful hand as the package labels. Do not sell this. He came home changed and still mended nets until his hands could not close. Callie set the medal apart from the money. The journal remained. It lay on the bench in its dark cover, strap curled like a sleeping thing. Her fingers went toward it twice and stopped twice. The day had already given too much. There was a measure to receiving, just as there was a measure to twisting fibre. Too much strain at once, and even good material could snap. She returned the money to the tin, not as neatly as it had been, but with all of it accounted for. She placed the tools back in their canvas, covered the raw hemp, set the medal on top of the journal, and sat in the long hall while the afternoon lowered around the high windows. The building had changed again. Not outwardly. The roof still sagged, the walls still leaned, the stove still needed attention, and the repair plan remained unwritten, but the silence had become inhabited by hands. Someone had cut that cavity, wrapped those tools, counted those coins, sealed that box, and trusted a future they had no power to command. Callie did not feel chosen. That would have been too grand a word and too dangerous. She felt noticed by the dead, which was different and heavier. As evening came, she carried the journal and the medal to the front room but left them unopened on the table. She lit the stove with cedar scraps and fed it carefully. Then she put on her coat and stepped outside before darkness took the clearing. The air smelled of wet grass and smoke. Beyond the walnut trees the land sloped toward unseen water, perhaps a creek swollen by rain, perhaps a marsh channel finding its way seaward. Callie followed the sound until she reached the edge of a low place where reeds stood black against the last light. Water moved there in narrow silver threads. A heron lifted from the far bank, slow-winged and silent, and crossed the sky without urgency. She stood until cold entered her sleeves, and the first star appeared over the dark line of trees. Behind her, inside the rope walk, the journal waited on the table. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Morning entered the front room without kindness, but it entered clean. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the window glass pale with salt mist and the clearing outside washed of its harsher edges. Callie woke beside the stove, which had gone grey in the night, its last coal hidden beneath ash like an eye nearly closed. For a while she did not move. The room held that fragile hour when cold had not yet won completely and daylight had not yet asked for work. A drop of water gathered at the ceiling seam, swelled, trembled, and fell into the flour tin with a sound so exact it seemed to belong to a metronome. The journal lay where she had left it on the table. Beside it, the medal darkened the wood with its small weight. The ribbon had dried overnight after being touched by the damp air, curling at one edge. The words on the medal remained legible in slanted light. Spanish War Service, 1898. She had read them too many times already, though. She had not yet allowed herself to open what waited beneath the leather strap. She made herself begin with ordinary things. Ash emptied into the pail, water set to boil, floor swept where soot had followed her boots from the chimney work, the repaired stove door checked, the rope gasket holding, the draught steady. She ate lentils warmed from the night before, standing near the stove because the chair still could not be trusted. Only after the pot was rinsed and turned upside down on the table did she wash her hands with soap from the library restroom, dry them on the cleanest part of her sleeve, and sit. The journal's cover was not smooth leather but something grainier, perhaps oilcloth overboard, dark brown where protected and nearly black along the edges. The strap had stiffened with time, and she eased it loose the way she had eased the cedar plugs from the twisting post. No hurry, no force. Inside, the first pages were filled with entries written in a hand that stopped her breath. Not because she knew it, because she nearly did. The letters were not Amos's, but they belonged to the same discipline. Upright, measured, patient with space. The capitals had small hooks at their beginnings. The lowercase t's were crossed low, exact, and the numbers leaned slightly forward as if walking into work. She had seen such handwriting on the labels in Amos's demonstration shed, on fibre cards and old repair receipts, and in the 3 penciled words she still carried folded inside her pocket-knife sheath. Slow is true. The journal began with dates, weather, orders, materials, repairs, rope lengths for a fisherman named J, bell, binder twine for a farmer near Langlois, net repair, 2 fathoms, paid in cash and smoked salmon. Then, tucked between 2 pages near the back, folded along 4 old creases, was a letter. The paper had yellowed, but it was dry. Callie placed both palms flat on the table before opening it. Outside, a crow called once from the walnut trees and then seemed to think better of continuing. The building waited. The stove clicked as metal cooled and warmed by turns. She unfolded the letter carefully, smoothing each crease only as far as it wished to go. Then she read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the post has kept its silence longer than I expected, and the house has done what I asked of it. It has waited. I do not know your name, your age, your troubles, or whether you came by blood, by purchase, by accident, or by the mercy of some road that brought you here cold and doubtful. I know only that you opened the old twisting post with enough care not to split the cedar plugs, and that tells me something of your hands. My name is Eleanor Ruth Whitaker, born Eleanor Haskell in Astoria, Oregon, in 1899, married into this rope walk in 1921, widowed in all but fact for many years before I admitted it aloud. I am writing this on March 14th, 1942, after my appointment with Dr. James Merriweather in Portland, who told me with a kindness I could not answer that the growth in my left lung has spread. He did not say how long in numbers. Men of his profession dislike numbers when the news is poor. But I have lived among measurements all my life, and I know the difference between a rope that will bear strain and one that has begun to part inside where the eye cannot see. Before I leave this place, I want to set down what was given to me and what I have hidden for the one who may need it. The Whitaker cordage line began before it bore that name. The first was Thomas Whitaker, born 1838 near Bath, Maine, a ship carpenter's son who went west after the war between the states and reached the Columbia by 1868, with 2 shirts, a draw knife, and a habit of saving bent nails. He learned rope work from a Swedish rope maker named Olof Nyberg in Astoria, where the river traffic was thick and every boat needed line. Thomas married Mary Ellen Price in 1871, and together they moved south in 1878, when the fishing grounds and coastal trade began calling for men who could repair gear without sending it north. Their son, Samuel Whitaker, born 1874 in a house above the fog, built the first longshed here in 1896, after a storm tore away half the town's net stores and taught everyone the cost of buying rope from too far away. Samuel married Rose Mickelson in 1898, a woman with hands stronger than some men's shoulders, and she is the reason the first accounts were kept properly. Her columns saved this place more than once. Their oldest boy, Nathaniel Thomas Whitaker, born 1900, was my husband. His brother was Elias. Their sister, Mercy, could lay hemp faster than either of them, but was told too often to mind the accounts. She minded them, then the hooks, then the men who told her she could not, and by 1919 nobody argued with Mercy when work needed finishing. Nathaniel and I kept this rope walk through lean years, wet years, good salmon runs, bad tariffs, and the arrival of cheaper cordage that came by rail and catalogue. We made net lines, halters, sash cord, hay rope, tow line, bell rope, clothes line, lead line, and the heavy hemp lengths used by 2 boatyards that are gone now. This house served fishermen, farmers, loggers, churches, widows with broken wells, boys building rafts, and one schoolteacher who insisted her classroom flag rope should be made by local hands even when I told her factory cord would cost less. The day that closed us was September 3rd, 1936. I write the date because dates matter. That morning, the buyer from Portland cancelled the winter order by telegram. By noon, the boatyard at Rogue River sent word that they had changed suppliers. That afternoon, Nathaniel's cough opened red into a handkerchief, and Elias, who had never feared weather, sat down on the back step and wept because there was no order book left to pretend over. We finished the lines already promised. We paid what we could. We locked the long haul on October 22nd of that year. For more than 30 years this place had spoken in footfalls, men walking backward, women sorting fibre, children sweeping, hooks turning, twine drawing through wax. After the closing silence took the building slowly, it entered first at the far hooks, then under the benches, then into the accounts. I came out here every week, even when there was no work, because a trade does not die on the day money stops. It dies when nobody remembers why it was honest. You will have found the medal. It belonged to Elias, Nathaniel's brother, who served in the Spanish-American War in 1898 and came home with a fever that never quite released him. Later, in the Great War, we lost my younger brother, Paul Haskell, at Meuse-Argonne in 1918. He was 23 and had hands too gentle for a rifle. His last letter smelled of damp wool and foreign mud. I keep his name here because houses forget, unless someone makes them remember. Now for the work, because memory without instruction is only sorrow. If the hemp you found is still dry at the core, do not waste it on a full rope first. Pull a sample no longer than 6 feet. Warm the room to at least 58 degrees if you can, 62 if the air is wet. Cold fibre snaps in pride and damp fibre lies about its strength. For softening, use 1 part boiled linseed oil to 12 parts warm water, with a spoon of wood ash lye if the fibre is stiff, but do not soak longer than 7 minutes. Hang it where air can move and turn it twice before nightfall. For a 3-strand utility rope, dress each strand with a light hand, comb, do not claw, keep the lay even. Mark your walking distance before beginning for every finished foot. Allow near 16 inches of take-up if the fibre is old, less if fresh. Twist each strand to the right until it begins to answer back against the fingers, then lay the rope to the left with steady tension. If one strand fattens, stop and draw it out. Do not correct imbalance by pulling harder at the end. That is how bad rope hides its weakness until someone trusts it. Tarred marline should be warmed near the stove, never on it. Beeswax must be soft enough to mark under the thumb but not shine wet. Sash cord needs a tighter lay than clothesline. Net mending twine wants patience more than strength. Bell rope for churches should be stretched overnight with a weight equal to half its working burden, then rested before serving. If you hear the fibres creak sharply, you have asked too much too fast. The money is not treasure, it is time. Use it as boards, lime, shingles, food, taxes, and the quiet dignity of refusing panic. Spend none of it to impress anyone. If you cannot keep this house, leave the tools for the one who may. If you can keep it, let the work teach you before you call yourself its owner. Inheritance is not what we receive because we deserve it. It is what survived long enough to ask something of us. I have been angry at what ended. I have been ashamed of what I could not save. I have sat in this room and counted coins while the roof leaked, and thought myself the last foolish woman guarding a dead trade. But age has made me less certain of endings. Seeds wait, iron waits in the ground, fibre waits in the stalk. A house may look empty while holding its breath for the next pair of careful hands. If you are of our blood, then welcome home. If you're not, then welcome all the same. Work makes kin where names fail. Behind the back door, 12 paces toward the walnut tree, you will find a horseshoe grown into the bark. Samuel placed it there for luck after the first paid order in 1896. Touch it when you're tempted to hurry. It has held longer than any of us. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Eleanor Ruth Whitaker, Whitaker and Sons Cordage. March 14th, 1942. Callie reached the end and did not move. The stove gave one small settling sound. The crow outside called again, farther away now. Morning had gone forward without asking permission, and light had shifted across the table until the letter lay half in brightness and half in shade. She read the signature once, then the line above it, then the opening again. My dear one, whoever you are. Only after a long while did she turn back to the first page and begin again. The second reading was slower. The names arranged themselves into a line of living people instead of facts. Thomas with bent nails, Mary Ellen keeping house wherever the fog allowed it, Samuel building the first long shed after a storm, Rose saving the accounts, Mercy putting her hands on the work no matter what anyone said, Nathaniel coughing red into a handkerchief, Elias weeping on the back step because no order book remained, Eleanor writing in the knowledge of a body already moving away from her. Callie did not cry. Her body did something quieter. Her shoulders lowered, and the hand that had held the paper too tightly opened by degrees. There are griefs that leave by water, and others that leave by loosening. She folded the letter along its original creases. Not new ones. The old lines knew where they belonged. She placed it inside the journal, laid the medal on top, then pressed both hands over the cover as if holding down a page in wind. The back door was swollen worse than the front. She lifted it, pulled inward, then shouldered it gently until the latch released. Cold daylight entered with the smell of wet grass and crabapple bark. 12 paces, the letter had said. She counted them from the threshold, not in a child's hurry, but in measured steps. Heel, toe, across moss and flattened weeds toward the walnut tree that stood nearest the outhouse. At first she saw nothing. The trunk was broad and dark with rain, its bark ridged and folded into deep seams. Lichen grew pale along the north side. A strand of old fencing wire had been swallowed near the base, leaving only 2 rusted points visible. She circled once, then again. On the third pass, with the light behind her, she saw the curve. A horseshoe, not hanging from a nail, not displayed. It had been nailed there when the tree was young, and the walnut had grown around it for nearly a century, taking iron into itself without surrendering the shape. Only the outer arc remained visible, blackened and half buried in living wood. One nail head showed at the bottom like a closed eye. Callie placed her fingers on the exposed iron. It was cold, colder than bark, colder than morning, and rough under the pads of her fingers. She stood there with the letter's words moving through her in no order. Touch it when you are tempted to hurry. The tree did not hurry. The iron did not explain itself. The old luck had not prevented loss, closure, illness, debt, or forgetting. It had only remained. That seemed more honest. When she returned inside, the front room had changed because she had. The same floorboards, same stove, same cracked mug holding the spent candle, same stains on the ceiling, yet the objects no longer looked abandoned in quite the same way. They looked interrupted. The work had stopped, but perhaps not ended. There was a difference. It was not a large difference, but it was one a person could stand on if she placed her weight carefully. She took the waxed canvas bundle of tools from the workbench and carried it to the table. The older brass gauge she set beside Amos's, 2 measures from different hands, answering each other across years. The serving mallet she wiped with a damp cloth and then with a dry one. The wooden fids she laid in order by size. The sailor's palm, stiff but intact, she placed near the journal. She did not arrange them for beauty. She arranged them so each could be seen. In the flour tin, beneath a nest of old paper, she had found a stub of a candle the day before. It was thicker than the library candle yellowed toward ivory, and wrapped near its base with a strip of paper on which someone had written Christmas 1962 in blue ink. Perhaps it had belonged to no ceremony. Perhaps someone had bought a box of them for a winter storm, and this one had been left behind. Still, it had survived 60 years in a tin through roof leaks, mice, county notices, and silence. Callie set it in the cracked mug after cleaning out the old wax. She struck a match. The wick took slowly, first smoking, then bending into flame. The smell was faintly sweet, old paraffin and dust. Light moved over the tools. The journal, the medal, the 2 brass gauges, and the folded letter tucked within its pages. It did not sanctify them. It simply allowed them to be present together. She sat beside that candle until the flame steadied. Then, without intending to, she began naming aloud the people who had carried her to that table. The assistant manager who left coffee on the milk crate and looked away to protect the gift from embarrassment, Nadine at the shelter, giving blue-darned socks without asking for a story in return, the farmer's wife outside Bandon, pointing toward the hay barn and telling her to be gone by morning, because that was the mercy she knew how to give, the librarian with silver glasses, placing a candle in a paper towel as if it were no more than a bookmark, Mrs. Voss drawing a line through the empty address field instead of making it a wound, Harlan leaving lentils and bouillon in the bag and charging 40 cents to a dead man's credit. None of them had saved her in the grand manner people like to tell. None had opened their home, adopted her sorrow, or promised rescue. Each had handed over one small length of fibre: coffee, socks, hay, candle, a line on a form, a ledger not closed, by themselves. They would not have held much, twisted together. They had made a rope. And here, if you're listening from your own house tonight, with the dishes done or not done, with rain at your window, or only the hum of the refrigerator keeping you company, I want to ask you to remember one small kindness you once received, not the large gesture people applauded, the quiet one, the ride offered without questions, the meal left by a door, the person who believed you were tired instead of lazy, the hand that signed your form, fixed your tire, answered your call, sat beside you, or said nothing when silence was the kinder language, if you can write it down. If the person is still living, tell them. If they are gone, speak their name once into the room. Small kindnesses do not disappear when they are spent. They enter the grain, they wait there like iron in a tree. Callie did not know she had been waiting to hear those names until the room held them. Afterward she made the day as ordinary as possible, because ordinary work was the only vessel large enough for what had happened. She carried the tin box to the front room and hid it beneath a loose floorboard she had already marked for repair, not because she distrusted the house, but because the house now trusted her. She placed the journal in the duffel wrapped in her clean shirt. The medal she set on the table beside the candle, where its dark ribbon could dry fully. The tools went back into canvas for the night. She wrote the first draft of the county repair plan on the back of Harlan's invoice. Roof stabilization, temporary plastic sheeting over western sag, wall bracing, chimney cleaned from below and above on November 8th, stove gasket replaced, need inspection when possible, no electrical use, no open flame unattended. She wrote carefully, leaving space for materials and dates she did not yet have. Her handwriting looked less like a person apologizing for taking up paper. By evening, fog had moved into the clearing and settled low around the walnut trunks. The house seemed afloat in it, long and narrow and more fragile than it had looked by daylight. Callie brought in enough deadfall for a small fire, fed the stove modestly, and warmed the room to something just short of comfort. The old candle burned beside the journal until its sides softened and ran in slow ridges down the mug. Before sleeping, she unrolled her blanket on the floor near the stove, closer than before but not too close. The duffel became her pillow. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, lay the journal and letter. Alongside her, within reach of her left hand, she placed Amos's gauge, Eleanor's older gauge, the serving mallet and the medal, not displayed, kept near. The flame in the stove lowered. Outside, water moved invisibly through the dark ground toward the marsh. Callie closed her eyes with the heirlooms beside her, and for the first time since the porch in the rain, her hand opened in sleep. The first snow came on December 4th, 2 inches by noon and another inch before evening. Wet enough to bend the salmonberry canes and heavy enough to show every weakness in the roof. Callie woke before daylight to a different silence. Snow did not strike like rain. It gathered, it pressed, it made the clearing listen to itself. When she opened the front door, the world had lost its hard edges. The walnut limbs were written over in white. The track lay hidden except for a shallow depression where her feet had passed the day before. Along the western third of the rope walk, snow had already found the sag between rafters and settled there more deeply, making the roofline look tired in a way that could no longer be excused as age. She did not climb that morning. She made coffee from grounds Harlan had included in a paper packet and read the roof chapter in Basic Rural Home Repair 3 times, once beside the stove, once at the table with the county repair notice beside it, and once standing in the long hall while looking up at the rafters themselves. The book's drawings were plain and not always patient, but they named things she had only guessed at: sister rafter, bird's mouth cut, roof felt, drip edge, shingle course, flashing, chalk line, nail schedule. The building's front room measured 12 feet by 14, but the failing section was larger, stretching 26 feet along the west end of the hall and roughly 11 feet from ridge to eave on each side. She measured with mason line and marked the numbers on a ledger page too swollen for its original use. 26 by 11 twice, plus waste. 5 bundles of cedar shingles would not do. 6 might, if she reused what remained sound beneath the moss. 1 roll of 15-pound felt, 2 pounds of 6D galvanized box nails for shingles, 1 pound of 10D common nails for sistering, 3 lengths of 2 by 6 fir for rafters, 1 strip of galvanized flashing near the chimney side, tarp until weather allowed more. She walked the list to Madson's Hardware with the snow turning to rain halfway down the track. Harlan read the measurements without comment, then read them again. You measured the slope or the floor? The slope. He gave the smallest nod. Good. Most people buy for the floor and curse the roof. The shingles came from weathered stock, bundles dark at the edges but dry inside. The felt roll had a torn wrapper. The nails he weighed into paper sacks, each one twisted closed with a motion that looked older than the store. When she asked the price, he wrote numbers on the invoice and then crossed out 2. That is not the price, she said. It is today's price. I have money now. He looked at her over the pale line of his moustache. Money does not mean you waste it proving you have some. She did not answer that. From beneath the counter, he brought a roofing hatchet with a worn hickory handle and a head blackened by years of tar, rain, and use. One edge was meant for cutting shingles, the other for setting nails, with a gauge notch worn almost smooth. My sister's husband used this after the Columbus Day storm, he said. He is dead, and his son is an insurance man in Eugene who would not know a chalk line from a clothesline. Bring it back when the roof no longer leaks. Callie took it with both hands. Yes. Sir, Cal Rusk may come by. Who is Cal Rusk? Former roofer. Former everything else he complains about. Bad knees. Good eyes. He will not take pay, so do not insult him early. Cal Rusk arrived the next morning in a faded brown pickup with a cracked windshield and a ladder rack, held together by more faith than metal. He was 74, perhaps older, short and square, with a white beard trimmed close and a wool cap pulled low over ears that had gone red from cold. He wore knee braces outside his work pants, and carried himself like a man negotiating with pain under private terms. He stood in the clearing and looked at the roof for 5 minutes without speaking. Callie waited beside the step. Finally he pointed toward the sag with his chin. That rafter failed first. She followed his line of sight. How can you tell? Snow tells. That was nearly the longest thing he said all day. They worked 11 days, not all full, not all dry. Some hours were spent only clearing snow and moss, some only measuring, some waiting under the tarp while rain moved through the trees hard enough to make conversation useless. Cal did not climb often. His knees refused ladders after the 3rd rung, but he could read a roof from the ground with almost frightening exactness. He called instructions in clipped phrases, each one practical as a nail. Foot there. Not there. That shingle's punky. Throw it. Lines wrong. Snap again. When Callie left a nail head high, proud of the shingle face, Cal tapped the ladder with his cane. That nail's proud. She looked down. Pull it. She pulled it. The first sister rafter took most of a day. Cal made her mark the damaged rafter at 3 points, then cut a matching 2x6 to run alongside it, long enough to bear beyond the split. The bird's mouth cut at the plate took 2 attempts, and one quiet curse she swallowed before it left her mouth. Cal saw anyway. Wood heard worse. They buttered the contact face with construction adhesive Harlan had sold at cost, then clamped the sister in place using 2 old C-clamps from the work hall and drove 10D nails in a staggered pattern every 16 inches. Cal insisted she pre-drill near the split to keep the old rafter from opening wider. He made her sight the line from below, then from the ladder, then from the far end of the hall. A roof is not flat, he said on the 4th day, after she had snapped a chalk line too tight and sent blue dust across her coat. It only lies about being flat. Follow the line. Trust your eye second. She learned to set shingles by rhythm. Lay. Gauge. Nail. Nail. 3 strokes if the hand was honest. 1 to seat. Vone to drive. Picture this one to finish. More than 3 meant she was tired or swinging wrong. Cal heard the difference from the ground. Too many. She stopped. Eat something. I am not hungry. Then eat while mistaken. He had brought boiled eggs in a tobacco tin and handed her 2 without looking at her. She ate them sitting on a bundle of shingles while rain clicked through cedar limbs and the open roof breathed cold into the hall below. By the 8th day, the damaged section had new felt and the first clean courses of shingles. By the 9th, her shoulders ached so deeply she could feel each heartbeat in the muscles between neck and spine. By the 10th, she began to understand the mercy of repetition. Her body stopped asking whether the work would end and simply learned the next motion. Lay, Gauge, nail, nail, breathe, move. On December 15th, under a sky the colour of pewter, they set the final shingle near the west eave. Cal climbed 2 rungs despite his knees, pressed one mittened hand along the course, and looked toward the ridge. He said nothing for so long that Callie began to worry she had missed some necessary correction. Then he stepped down. "It will shed," from Cal Rusk. That was praise nearly extravagant. That evening, snow turned to rain again, and Callie stood inside the long hall with 3 tins set beneath the former leaks. The roof answered with a deep, steady drumming, but no water came through the repaired section. She watched the dry floor until dark covered it. The building had received its first promise. By January, the cold had entered the brick. The chimney had drawn well enough for a careful fire, but drawing was not the same as being sound. Once the roof no longer leaked over the western hall, Callie began to notice the fine red powder that appeared each morning near the stove wall. At first she swept it without understanding. Then she looked closer and saw the lower bricks shedding at the corners, flaking in thin scales where moisture had entered, frozen, opened and thawed again, spalling. The repair book used the word with no pity. She walked to town with a sample in her pocket wrapped in newspaper. Harlan crushed it between thumb and forefinger over the counter. Chimneys eating itself. Can it be stopped? For a while. Everything is for a while. He sold her hydraulic lime, a small bag of fire clay, clean mason's sand, and a pointing trowel narrow enough to enter the old joints. He refused to sell Portland cement for the repair, though it sat in a stack by the back wall. Too hard, he said. Old brick needs mortar that gives before brick does. Cement will win the fight and ruin what it wins. The mix he wrote on the invoice was exact. 2 parts hydraulic lime, 1 part fire clay near heat, 6 parts sharp sand, water added slowly until the mortar held a ridge on the trowel but did not slump. For outer joints away from heat, 1 part lime to 3 parts sand. Mist old brick first. Rake joints to sound material. Never smear the face if she could help it. Keep the work covered from frost. The first week, she did more removing than repairing. The chimney's lower stack, where it passed through the front room wall and rose beside the stove, had lost mortar in seams deep enough to take the handle of her spoon. She laid canvas under the work area and used an old screwdriver, the wire brush, and finally the narrow chisel. Cal loaned her in a coffee can marked "Bring back or else." Powdered mortar fell in pale heaps. Some joints were dry as bone, others were damp and sour-smelling. She worked slowly because every scrape sounded like injury. Outside temperatures stayed in the 20s most mornings, sometimes 26, sometimes 23. Once 19 at dawn, according to the thermometer Harlan had nailed beside his store door and told her to borrow until spring. Inside the front room, with the fire banked low and the chimney under repair, warmth came grudgingly. She could not keep a strong fire while repointing near the thimble. Too much heat dried the mortar badly, too little left her fingers stiff after minutes. Every 15 minutes her bare hands went numb. Gloves made the trowel clumsy and hid the mortar's texture, so she worked barehanded, then stopped when her fingertips became useless and held them over a cup of warm water until pain returned. At first the pain frightened her more than numbness. It arrived sharp and personal, as if each finger had been accused. After a while she accepted it as part of the day's schedule. Rake, brush, mist, press mortar, strike joint, warm hands, repeat. The mortar itself taught her more than the book, too dry, and it crumbled at the edge, too wet, and it smeared over brick faces and dried with a weak shine. Good mortar entered the joint reluctantly and stayed when pressed. She packed the deeper gaps in lifts, letting the first firm before adding more. Near the stove thimble she used the lime and fireclay mix, pressing it around the old opening with a margin trowel, wiping excess immediately with a damp rag. She learned to use the jointer lightly, not carving, only finishing the seam so water would have less invitation. The work lasted 3 weeks. There were days when she repaired only 12 joints, days when frost made outside work impossible, and she turned instead to drying ledger books near the stove, page by page weighted under boards. Days when smoke from a neighbour's chimney crossed the clearing and made her hungry for houses where someone else had decided what was safe. On the worst morning she mixed too much mortar and watched half of it stiffen uselessly in the pail before she could place it. She carried the hardened mass outside and set it near the back step, ashamed of the waste. Cal Rusk came by once, stood in the doorway, and inspected the joints without removing his cap. Too proud. She looked at the line she had finished. The mortar? He nodded. She took the jointer and pressed the seam flatter. Better. Then he left. By late January the lower stack had a steadier face. Not new, not pretending to be. The bricks remained varied, some dark from heat, some pale where old plaster had once met them, some chipped at corners beyond repair. But the joints were filled with honest material, shaped to shed dust instead of making more. Outside, she climbed the ladder on the driest afternoon of the month, and patched the upper mortar where she could safely reach, covering the fresh work each night with burlap and plastic held by mason line. The test fire came on January 28th. She waited until afternoon, when the mortar had cured long enough and the outside air stood at 32 degrees without wind. She laid a small fire first, cedar shavings, 2 split pieces of dry alder from Caleb's pile behind the church, 1 twist of paper. The stove drew. She watched the thimble. No smoke leaked. She added another stick. The fire deepened orange behind the stove door's small mica window. Outside, she walked into the clearing and looked up. Smoke rose from the chimney in a clean, narrow column, then bent toward the trees. No dark spill from cracks. No lazy seep through failed joints. Just smoke going where smoke was meant to go. Callie stood there with lime dust still caught in the lines of her hands and watched until the cold reached her knees. Inside, the front room warmed by degrees. The brick held heat differently now, not greedily, not dangerously, but with the slow courtesy of something repaired before it failed completely. That night she slept without waking every hour to listen for trouble in the flue. It was not trust yet. It was the beginning of it. The flaws had been waiting beneath everything. For 2 months, Callie had treated them as uncertain ground, stepping around softened boards, sweeping dirt from grooves, laying newspaper where the cold rose most insistently. But after the roof stopped leaking and the chimney held fire properly, the floorboards began to show themselves less as hazard and more as record. White pine, the repair book suggested, though darkened almost beyond recognition by age, boot oil, hemp dust, stove ash, spilled tar, and the long traffic of work. Some planks were 14 inches wide, one was 16, hand-sawn and slightly crowned in the middle. The nails were rose-head, not uniform, each one set by a person's hand rather than a machine's indifference. She did not want to erase that. Harlan rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day and made her repeat the instructions before he released it across the counter. Do not tilt it. Do not stop while it is running. Do not start with fine grit. Do not sand through history trying to make a hotel floor. He looked at her then. That last one matters. She began in the front room after moving everything she owned to the long hall. Duffel, tools, journal, tin box, cooking pot, candle mug, folded blanket, repair book, and the chair Cal had fixed with a scrap stretcher. She pulled old nails that had no work left, set loose rose heads with a nail punch, and marked 3 boards for future repair. The sander was heavier than expected, loud enough to fill her teeth and impatient in the hands. It wanted to run. She made herself guide, not force. First pass, 80 grit. The room filled with the smell of opened pine, not fresh exactly, but released, as if the wood had been holding summer far below the dirt. She worked with the grain where possible, slow overlapping paths, never staying long where stains went deep. The darkest scars remained, a round burn near the stove, black crescent marks under where a chair had once rocked. 2 pale gouges by the threshold, a scatter of tiny holes near the wall where some long-ago rack had been fixed. She kept them. Second pass, 120 grit. The boards changed from rough to touchable. Her shoulders learned the sander's weight. Fine dust settled over her hair, lashes, sleeves, and the stove's black iron, turning everything a single pale colour. She wore the dust mask until the elastic cut the back of her neck, then tied it with cotton string. When she stopped for water, the silence after the machine seemed almost too large. Third pass, 220 grit. This pass was not about correction. It was about listening. The sander moved more lightly, taking down raised grain, softening edges, leaving the old floor neither polished nor raw. She finished after dark by lantern and woke the next day to see what she had done. The pine had colour now. Under dirt and ash, it had kept a dark honey tone that deepened near the stove and along traffic paths toward a reddish mahogany. The grain rose and turned like slow water. Each board was different, and together they carried the long room's memory without needing dirt to prove it. For finish, Harlan recommended oil, tung if she could afford it, linseed if she could not, or a careful blend if she meant to be patient. She chose a mixture, 2 parts tung oil to 1 part boiled linseed oil for the first coat, thinned slightly with citrus solvent from a dented can sold cheap because the label had peeled. He warned her about oily rags, spontaneous combustion, and fools. Lay them flat outside, stone on top. Do not wad them. I won't. People say that before they burn barns. She applied the first coat on her knees with a lint-free rag cut from an old cotton shirt. The wood drank unevenly. Some boards darkened at once, others resisted, and then opened slowly. She wiped excess after 30 minutes, as the can instructed, then checked again an hour later. The room smelled of oil, pine, and orange peel. For the first time, the front room looked less like a place she had occupied and more like a place she was answering. The cure required 48 hours before the next coat. Waiting became part of the repair. She kept to the hall, stepping only on boards laid across the treated floor when necessary, and used the time to clean tools, copy Eleanor's instructions into a separate notebook, and write down every expenditure from the tin box. She spent coins and bills only after recording their denomination, year, if notable, amount and purpose, shingles, lime, fire clay, food, county filing fee, sander rental, oil, nothing else. Second coat. 48 hours. Third coat. 48 hours. By the end, the floor did not shine like varnished furniture. It glowed low, as if light had entered and decided to remain under the surface. In evening, with the stove lit, the pine warmed toward amber. The dark marks stayed. The old nail heads caught light like small, patient stars. Then came the bad morning. It was January 31st, frost on the inside of the window, the pump handle frozen until noon, a letter from the county requiring additional details on wall bracing, written in official language that made every sentence feel like a closed gate. Callie read it twice and understood almost none of it. Her hands were cracked from lime and oil, her back hurt from sanding, the repaired roof still needed inspection. The long hall still held more work than one body could name without becoming smaller. She set the letter on the table, put on her coat, and walked away from the house. Not far, only to the marsh beyond the walnut trees where winter reeds stood broken, and the water moved under a skin of thin ice near the edges. She sat on a fallen log with her hands tucked into her sleeves and watched a great blue heron stand in the shallows. The bird did nothing for a long time. It lifted one foot, placed it down with priestly care, and waited. Its grey body seemed made of the same weather as the morning. Once it struck, drew up something silver and small, swallowed, and returned to stillness. Callie did not work that day. She did not earn rest. She did not justify it. She sat until the numbness in her feet became uncomfortable, then painful, then part of the landscape. The heron remained after she rose. Back at the rope walk, The letter from the county still waited on the table, but it did not fill the room as it had before. The next morning she carried it to Mrs. Voss, who read it, marked the margin with 3 practical notes, and told her which line mattered. "Give them dates," the clerk said. "Officers trust dates when they cannot understand courage." Callie wrote dates. By February. The windows had become the building's eyes, and most of them were either blind or injured. There were 8 in all, 2 in the front room, 6 set high along the south wall of the rope walk. 3 had no glass, only scraps of plastic, old cardboard, and 1 feed sack nailed across the openings by some former trespasser. 4 were cracked, some in simple lines, 1 in a branching pattern like winter lightning. The last, the narrow window nearest the twisting post, held its original glass, wavy and faintly green at the edges. In one corner, scratched with a diamond point or a hard nail, was 1788. That made no sense for the building as it stood. Harlan looked at the rubbing Callie made of the mark and shrugged. Could be salvaged glass from somewhere older. People reused what did not leak. I should not replace it. You should not touch it unless it falls on your foot. For the missing panes, he sold her salvaged glass from an upstairs room behind the store, each piece wrapped in newspaper and carried down by a teenage boy with large ears and solemn eyes. For the cracked panes, Harlan showed her how to remove points, soften old putty with patience rather than heat where the wood was dry, and bed the glass properly. He sold her a small can of DAP 33 glazing putty, a packet of glazier's points, and 2 lengths of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. "Putty should be warm in your hand," he said, rolling a piece between his palms. "Not sticky. Not cold. Press a bed first. Set the glass into the bed. Points flat. Then face putty at an angle so water leaves." She practiced on a scrap frame behind the store until the bevel looked less like a child had iced a cake with a spoon. The rope walk's sash was simple but stubborn. Years of paint, salt air, swelling, and neglect had joined parts never meant to become one. She worked with the window laid flat across sawhorses in the front room, stove warming the putty just enough, not too near. The old glazing came away in chips, powder, and occasional long strips that lifted cleanly, with a satisfaction she tried not to trust too much. The first pane took nearly a full day. She cleaned the rabbit with a putty knife, brushed away dust, pressed a thin bed of putty, set the salvaged glass, and held her breath as she pushed the glazier's points into place with the edge of the knife. The glass made a small living sound under pressure, and she eased back at once. Too much force could make repair into breaking. When the pane held, she rolled putty between both palms, laid it along the edge, and drew the knife at a steady angle. Her first bevel was uneven. She scraped it off and began again. The second was better. By the third window her hands knew the warmth needed. By the fourth she understood that corners were where impatience confessed. Good glazing turned a corner without a lump, sealed without shouting, and asked paint later to protect it. She marked each repaired sash with a pencil date on the inner edge, where no one would see unless they removed it again. The cotton sash cord was its own lesson. The front room windows had counterweights hidden in pockets along the jambs, though one pocket cover had been painted shut and the other nailed after the cord failed years before. Callie pried carefully, found the iron weights resting like sleeping fish in the dark channels, and cleaned out mouse nesting from around them. Harlan had insisted on cotton rather than nylon. "Old pulleys like old manners," he said. "Nylon slips." She fed the 1/4-inch cord over the pulley, tied the counterweight with a figure-8 knot backed by a half hitch, then tested the rise, too short the first time, too long the second. On the third attempt, the lower sash lifted, paused, and remained open on its own for the first time perhaps in decades. Cold air entered, but so did something else, proportion. The room could breathe without being wounded. She left the original glass for last. The marked pane near the twisting post was not truly square, and its waves bent the view outside into softened lines. Through it, the walnut trees looked older than themselves, each branch slightly displaced, each patch of sky held in uneven thickness. The putty around it had cracked, but the glass still sat firm. Rather than remove it, she cleaned the surface with water, vinegar, and a cloth so soft it barely deserved the name rag. She touched the scratched numbers only once.
Swen for month 17,759. 7 funts 7 for an 18. Picture licked 7. 3,000. 4 nuts left.
One. Licked. Perhaps the glass had come from a ship, perhaps from an older house dismantled for parts. Perhaps the mark meant something else entirely, a measurement, a joke, a hand practicing. She did not decide. Not everything kept by a building had to explain itself on the first asking. The last repair was the high south window nearest the walnut branch. She had set the sash across the workbench, sunlight thin but present for once, putty warmed in her palm, points arranged in a saucer, glass cleaned and waiting outside. The day had softened, snow still lay in shaded patches, but the eaves dripped steadily and the creek beyond the marsh had grown louder. She worked the final bevel slowly, drawing the knife from corner to corner, wiping the blade between passes. The line came clean. She stood back, saw one small ridge, and smoothed it with a wet finger. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside the open frame. It was so light the branch hardly moved. Black cap, white cheek, small grey body made round against the cold. The bird turned its head once, looking in with the alert, untroubled attention of wild things. Callie stayed still, putty knife in hand. The chickadee hopped closer, peered at the room, then flew off toward the creek with one quick flicker of wings. Callie set the last glazier's point. By evening all 8 windows held wind at a distance. 3 new panes, 4 mended, 1 old glass honoured and left in place. The front room no longer shivered at every gust. In the long hall light entered cleanly from the south, and lay across the restored floor in narrow bands, reaching almost to the twisting post before fading. She washed the putty from her hands, banked the stove, and wrote in her notebook, February 19th, windows closed, house warmer. Chickadee witnessed. Late February brought a different kind of repair, quieter than roof work and less dangerous than chimney brick, but more intimate in its demands. The plaster had failed in 3 patches near the chimney where old heat, roof water and time had worked together with the patience of thieves. At first Callie had seen only broken wall. Then, after brushing away loose lime and lifting a curled edge with the putty knife, she saw what lay beneath: hand-split oak lath, narrow and irregular, each strip fastened with small dark nails and spaced just wide enough for plaster to push through and make its keys. Embedded in the old brown coat were hairs, pale and dark, stiff as memory. Horsehair plaster. Harlan looked pleased when she brought in a sample, though his face did not change enough for anyone else to accuse him of it. Original, he said. How do I patch it without lying? With lime. Sand. Hair. Time. From an upper shelf, he took down a paper bag folded over twice and tied with cotton string. The label had browned, but the printing remained faintly visible. Plaster hair, 1950s stock. He weighed out only what she needed, then added a small bag of lime putty he had kept sealed in a plastic pail for repairs no one wanted to do properly. 3 coats, he said. Scratch first. Push it through the lath. Score it. Let it set. Brown coat after, 3/8 if the wall asks for it. Finish coat thin, 1/8. Keep it damp enough to cure slow. How slow? Slower than you prefer. She smiled a little at that, and he pretended not to notice. The first patch was the largest, a ragged oval beside the chimney where plaster had let go from the lath and hung loose behind wallpaper scraps so old the pattern had faded into shadows of flowers. Callie cut back to sound edges with the knife, brushed dust from the lath, and misted everything with water until the oak darkened. The scratch coat felt coarse under the trowel, gritty with sand, fibrous with hair, and reluctant to stay where placed. She pressed it through the gaps so it mushroomed behind the lath, forming new keys. Then she scored the face with horizontal lines using an old comb Harlan had handed her from a drawer. The brown coat came 3 days later, after the scratch had set firm but not dry as bone. She mixed it thicker, working until her wrist ached, then pressed it to within 3/8 of the finished wall plane. The patch did not flatten easily. Old walls had waves, and new work looked foolish when it pretended otherwise. She learned to follow the wall rather than correct it. 72 hours. She waited. The finish coat was the hardest because it asked for restraint. Thin lime plaster on the trowel. 1/8 inch. Smooth enough to receive paint one day, but not so slick it forgot the wall around it. She feathered the edges with a damp brush, stepped back, and saw that the repair was visible, not ugly. Visible. These patches will hold another 100 years, she said into the room. The sentence surprised her. It sounded like confidence, but it was only care spoken aloud. Doris Bell owned the Blue Gull Cafe and had the kind of face that seemed always to be deciding whether a person needed coffee, soup, or correction. She was broad-shouldered, grey-haired, and wore her apron tied high with pencils, order slips, and a church key bottle opener in the front pocket. Callie had avoided the cafe at first because warmth behind glass could feel like an accusation when a person had no money to enter. But after the roof work began, paper bags started appearing on the rope walk's front step. The first held potato soup in a jar, 2 biscuits wrapped in foil, and a note written on an order pad. Bring back jar. No hurry, Doris. Callie brought the jar back washed. Doris took it without thanks and pointed toward a stool. You eat yet? Yes. Ma'am. Not what I asked. Callie sat. Thereafter the bags came irregularly, never often enough to seem like charity arranged on a schedule, never rarely enough to be accidental. Ends of bread, a cup of stew, apple peelings for vinegar, once a slice of gingerbread wrapped in wax paper, still soft at the centre. When Callie tried to pay after selling 2 salvaged metal scraps to the junk man, Doris set the coins back on the counter. In candles when the shop reopens? It is not a shop yet. Doris poured coffee for a fisherman at the other end of the counter. Then I'm investing early. Caleb Mickelson arrived by bicycle after school on a Tuesday, coasting down the track on a red Schwinn with a bent rear fender and a milk crate wired over the back wheel. He was 16, lean and serious, with wrists too large for his sleeves and hair that never seemed fully combed. He carried a splitting maul across the handlebars as if it were ordinary to arrive armed for firewood. My mother said you need kindling. Callie looked past him toward the road, then back. Your mother knows that. She knows everything within 2 miles. He split cedar rounds behind the woodshed for an hour, with the grave concentration of a person trying not to show pride in being useful. His swings were awkward at first, then steadier. Callie offered money from the repair envelope. Caleb shook his head before the bills cleared her pocket. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. Later, she learned that Caleb's mother was a Mickelson, from the same family that had once married into the rope walk, though neither Caleb nor his mother spoke of kinship as if it required performance. He came twice a week after that when weather allowed, sometimes bringing split wood, sometimes only news. The county inspector had been seen at the post office. Harlan's knee was bothering him. Doris had burned a pot of beans and blamed the stove. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning at 7:30. Long coat buttoned, hat brim low, hands clasped behind his back. He served a white-painted church near a town, but his morning walk carried him along the old road, past the walnut trees and the first bend of the track. The first week Callie saw only his outline between trunks. The second, he lifted his hat. The third, he stopped at the track entrance but did not come in. "You Miss Whitaker?" "Yes, sir." He was tall and spare, with dark skin weathered by salt wind, and a voice that seemed to have been used carefully for many years. "I knew Amos." Many people seemed to have known Amos in pieces. Rope hands? Clean splices, accounts left open in mercy. Lines repaired after storms. Callie nodded, because that was sometimes enough. Reverend Boyd did not offer to save the building. He did not ask whether she was attending church. He did not fill the clearing with advice. Each morning, when he passed the walnut trees, he tipped his hat toward the rope walk and spoke 4 words, soft but not secret. "Lord, keep this house." Then he continued down the road, leaving the prayer behind like a small stone set at the threshold. The cellar waited until February 11th because Callie did not trust underground places during heavy rain. The door to it lay beneath a sloped hatch behind the back room, half covered by blackberry runners and a sheet of corrugated metal someone had once used as a weight. She had passed it many times, she had even cleared around it after the first hard freeze, but there had been enough work above ground to occupy her courage, and cellars asked a different kind of attention. Damp, dark, stone air that had not been moved in a while. On the morning she finally opened it, the sky was high and pale, and the ground had been dry for 3 days. The hatch lifted with difficulty, hinges crying out in flakes of rust. Beneath it, 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet by 15, fieldstone walled, floored in packed earth and flat stones worn level by feet, and storage barrels. The air smelled of minerals, apples long gone, and cold water moving somewhere below hearing. Callie stood at the top with a lantern in one hand and waited for the old air to meet the new. The steps were sound. At the bottom she found empty shelves, a broken crock, 3 rusted hoops from barrels, a stack of slate pieces, and 1 narrow drain cut through the far wall to carry seep water away. In the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab, cleaner edged than the fieldstone around it, nearly 3 feet by 4. On its face was carved a mark she recognized only partly, 3 twisted lines meeting in a loop like strands beginning to become rope. She knelt beside it and brushed dirt from the groove. The slab did not belong to ordinary storage. It had been placed deliberately. The craft mark was old, careful, and worn at the edges, not by walking but by touch. Her fingers followed it once. Then she stood, Do not lift what you cannot answer, she told herself. The slab could wait. On the way back up, her lantern light caught something under the third step. Not beneath the stone itself, but wedged in a narrow cavity where the side wall had shifted away from the stair. At first, she thought it was another piece of root. Then she saw the corner. Oak. A small box. Darkened by age, no longer than her hand and twice as wide, fitted with a sliding lid. It took 10 minutes to work it free without damaging the step. Upstairs. In daylight, she opened it on the table. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in tissue. The key's bow was shaped like the rope mark from the granite slab, 3 strands looping into one eye. The shaft was short, the bit complex and oddly cut. It did not match the front door, cellar hatch, old desk drawer, stove, or any lock Callie had yet found. She set it in her palm and felt the strange authority of a thing made for one purpose and refusing all others. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of the rope walk in summer. The building was sharper then, its siding dark, its sign newly painted, its windows whole. The woman wore a long skirt, boots and a blouse with sleeves rolled to the elbows. In her right hand she held a serving mallet. Her hair was parted in the middle and pinned back severely, but the face, even through the tin-type's stiff old light, made Callie sit down. It was not her face exactly. It was near enough to trouble the room. The same narrow chin, the same left eyebrow lifting slightly higher than the right, the same way the mouth seemed to be holding back words until they had earned speaking. On the back, written in ink-faded brown, were the words Mercy Rose Whitaker, daughter of Samuel, age 25, summer of 1903. Callie placed the photograph beside the journal, then set the brass key on the mantel where she could see it from the floor. She did not yet know what it opened. That felt proper. A house should not give all its answers in one winter. By March, snow retreated into the ditches and shaded roots, leaving the clearing soft underfoot and loud with meltwater. The creek beyond the marsh, nearly hidden all winter by reeds and grey distance, began speaking in a fuller voice. It rushed over stones, dragged leaves from bank hollows, and carried small broken sticks toward the culvert under the road. Walnut catkins lengthened from bare branches, green-brown and delicate, swaying in damp wind. The crabapple behind the outhouse set tight buds along its twigs. Moss brightened on the stones. Every surface seemed to exhale. The house changed with the season, not suddenly, not like a curtain opened, but by small permissions. Windows held, chimney drew, the patched plaster cured without cracking. The floor no longer lifted splinters into her socks. The roof shed spring rain with a sound that still made her pause and listen, grateful each time no drip answered inside. The county inspector came in late March, walked the perimeter, tapped 2 braces, examined the roofline, and looked at her repair plan with a pencil behind one ear. Not habitable by code, he said. I know. Stabilized enough to suspend demolition. She held the sentence still so it would not break. For now, he added. For now is enough. He looked at her then, perhaps hearing more in those words than she meant to give him. He signed the form on the hood of his truck and left a yellow copy on the table. She did not begin making rope that spring. The decision surprised people who knew just enough of the story to expect a neat turning. Harlan asked only once. Doris did not ask at all. Caleb looked disappointed, then tried to hide it by kicking a pine cone off the track. But Callie had read Eleanor's instructions too often to mistake possession for readiness. The hemp in the post had waited 8 decades, it could wait 1 more season. She spent 1 coin, a mercury dime too worn to hold numismatic value, recording it in the notebook before exchanging it through Harlan for sample fibres, beeswax, and a small spool of linen thread. She practiced on lengths no longer than her arm. Bad cord, uneven cord, cord that kinked, cord that looked sound until weighted, cord cut apart and studied. She learned how old instructions felt in new hands. On April evenings when rain softened and the sky held light past supper, she sat in the doorway with samples across her lap and listened to the creak. The brass key remained on the mantel. Mercy's photograph stood beside the candle mug. The repaired windows held the reflection of the room after dark, and sometimes Callie saw her own face near Mercy's in the glass. Not identical, not separate. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished rope came off the walk under snowfall so light it seemed uncertain whether it meant to become weather. Callie had warmed the long hall since morning, not hot, only steady, holding the room near 62 degrees the way Eleanor's letter instructed. The stove in the front room sent heat down the hall slowly, helped by a small fan powered from the electrical line, finally restored that autumn by a licensed man from Gold Beach who hummed hymns under his breath while labelling every breaker. The Hemp had been opened 3 days earlier, aired, combed and tested, not the oldest protected bundle from the post, that remained mostly untouched. This was new hemp ordered through Harlan, coarse at first, then kinder after dressing. Caleb, now taller and pretending not to be, stood near the far hooks to watch tension. Harlan sat in the mended chair by the door, claiming he had come only to make sure she did not ruin good fibre. Doris had sent stew in a jar and refused to attend because, as she put it, I do not cry at cordage. Reverend Boyd had passed at 7:30 and left his 4 words at the walnut trees. Callie walked backward along the length of the hall, fibre moving through her hands in a pale living line. The hooks turned, the strands tightened, twist entered them gradually. First as suggestion, then as form, then as strength. She heard Amos in the silence before instruction. She heard Eleanor in measurements. She heard Cal in the roof's dry patience above her. The finished rope was modest, 24 feet of 3-strand utility line, clean enough to use, imperfect enough to teach. It lay across the bench in the afternoon light, smelling faintly of hemp, wax, and warm room. Harlan ran one thumb along the lay. It will hold. Callie closed her hand once, then opened it. Inside, the restored rooms had become neither museum nor spectacle. The front room held the pot-bellied stove, blacked and sound, a pine table repaired with one visible butterfly patch, 2 chairs, shelves for ledgers and tools, and a narrow bed built into the corner where newspapers had once been her only insulation from the floor. The floorboards kept their dark marks, the plaster patches showed in certain light, the old glass by the twisting post remained wavy and green at the edge, turning winter branches into something almost underwater. The long hall served work again. Hooks cleaned and oiled, twisting post repaired but not over-polished, fibre stored in labelled bundles along the south wall, a small ledger open on the bench, not many orders. Enough. Sash cord for Mrs. Voss's cousin, bell rope for Reverend Boyd's church, garden line for Doris, demonstration pieces mailed to women from the cafe corkboard list who wrote checks in careful handwriting and included notes about fathers, barns, grandmothers, and things they wished they had learned before everyone who knew them was gone. The brass key did not reveal itself until that second winter. It happened after a windstorm took down one of the outer walnut limbs and left torn wood high on the old tree where the horseshoe had grown into the bark. Callie went out with pruning saw, ladder, and a reluctance that felt almost like apology. The tree had guarded the clearing longer than any living person. She cut only what had split, cleaned the wound as Cal advised, and brushed moss from the trunk where water had been collecting. That was when her thumb found brass. Not the horseshoe. Higher, nearly hidden under a fold of bark, was a narrow plate greened by weather and swallowed at the edges. It had no handle, no hinge visible at first, only a keyhole dark as a seed. The plate had been set into the walnut when the tree was younger, and then half taken in as it grew, the way it had taken iron. Callie stood on the ladder for a long time, rain ticking from the branches onto her cap. Then she went inside and took the key from the mantel. It fit without persuasion. The plate opened inward on a tiny compartment cut into a dead section of heartwood. The living tree had grown around but not destroyed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and cedar shavings, was a folded 48-star flag and a note written on paper so thin she feared her breath might move it apart. The flag was small, hand-hemmed, its stars arranged in rows from another country's map of itself. 48 stars meant a time before Alaska and Hawaii joined the field. The note was dated November 11th, 1918. Mercy Rose Whitaker had written it. To the daughter who may come after me. Today the bells rang for the armistice, and still Paul does not come home. We raised this flag in the work hall at noon because the town asked every house with a flag to show it. I folded it before sunset. Cloth can honour what shouting cannot. If you find this, remember that work is not less sacred because it is ordinary. Men go to war. Women keep accounts. Children sweep. Rope holds boats, bells, wells, roofs, and sometimes the living to the living. Do not let anyone tell you that daughters only inherit what sons forget. Mercy Rose Whitaker, November 11th, 1918. Callie folded the note along its lines and did not read it again until she was inside. Then she placed the flag on the table beside the Spanish War Medal and the photograph of Mercy at 25, holding the serving mallet in front of the very building where Callie now stood with rainwater on her sleeves. The next Memorial Day, May 27, 2024, she took the Spanish War Medal to the Port Orford Pioneer Cemetery, where Harlan had helped her locate Elias Whitaker's grave in a row beneath wind-shaped cypress. The stone was modest, its inscription softened by lichen. She did not leave the medal there. Eleanor had said not to sell it, not to abandon it to weather. Instead, Callie held it in her palm while Reverend Boyd read the name aloud, and she placed a small coil of new hemp line at the base of the stone. The medal returned to the rope walk and hung thereafter in a shadow box made from scrap cedar and old glass. The money remained mostly as Eleanor had intended, time, not treasure. Callie spent 3 gold coins only after having them appraised properly in Coos Bay, and even then she wrote their departure into the ledger with a description, date, buyer and purpose, electrical restoration, insurance, county fees, a winter reserve. A 4th coin, a common silver dollar, went for the first order of new hemp fibre, because beginning the work seemed a proper use of old weighting. The rest she sealed again, not in secrecy exactly, but in stewardship. She did not put it back inside the twisting post. That hiding place had done its service. Instead, beneath the ledger shelf in the front room, she built a cedar-lined box with a brass hasp and placed inside it the remaining bills. Coins, Eleanor's accounting slip, a copy of the repair ledger, and a note in her own hand, for the next one, if need comes before readiness. Spend slowly. Keep records. Leave more than money. The rope walk reopened without announcement. No ribbon, no article, no photograph in the newspaper with Callie standing stiffly beside a sign. Doris placed 1 index card on the Blue Gull Cafe corkboard between a notice for crab pots and a flyer for a church supper. Hand-laid hemp cordage. Repairs considered. Whitaker Rope Walk, Old Harbour Road. Leave note with Doris. By the end of the first month, 43 names had entered the mailing list ledger. Some belonged to locals who wanted garden line, sash cord, bell pulls or repair work for decorative netting. Others came from farther away, people who had seen the card while passing through and wrote later from Salem, Spokane, Reading, and once from Minnesota. Their letters arrived with careful questions. Could she make a short length for a porch swing? Did she repair old rope beds? Could she send a sample for a museum display? Did hemp smell the way it had in their grandfather's barn? Callie answered slowly. Work did not become large. It became steady. That was better. Caleb returned one April afternoon with something wrapped in an old quilt across the back of his truck. The red Schwinn had long since been outgrown, though he still kept it, he said, because his mother claimed a person should remember the first machine that carried him farther than his feet wanted to go. He had learned carpentry from a cousin in Brookings and had begun carving in evenings with the seriousness he once gave to splitting kindling. "What is that?" Callie asked. "Do not start guessing." Together they carried the wrapped board to the front of the rope walk. Harlan happened to be there. Doris too, though she claimed she had only come to retrieve jars. Reverend Boyd had paused at the end of his walk, hat in hand. Mrs. Voss stood near the walnut trees with a folded coat over one arm, having brought a copy of an old parcel map she thought Callie should see. Caleb pulled the quilt away. The sign was cedar. Hand-carved, painted in deep green with cream letters shaded by his knife. It kept the old name, but amended it with a mercy history had owed for some time. Whitaker Daughters Cordage. Hemp. Line. Net repair. The plural rested there without apology. Callie touched the carved letters. The cedar was smooth beneath the paint, and in the lower corner Caleb had carved the rope mark from the granite slab, 3 strands entering one loop. "You do not have daughters," Doris said, softer than usual. Callie looked at the sign, then at Mercy's photograph visible through the front window, then at the long hall beyond where the hooks waited for the next length. "No," she said. But the house did. They hung it from the old chains above the door. The building seemed taller afterward, though no board had moved. That night, after everyone left and the clearing settled into its own sounds, Callie sat at the pine table with the journal open, Eleanor's letter beside it, Mercy's note beneath the lamp, and a blank sheet waiting before her. Outside, spring rain moved gently over the roof she had repaired by Cal's instruction. The chimney held a low fire. The windows reflected the room in 8 separate pieces. She had delayed writing because some acts felt too large when named directly, yet every ledger entry, every repaired joint, every ordered coil and answered letter had been a draft of this one. She sharpened a pencil with Amos's pocket knife, tested the point on the margin, and wrote the same opening words that had found her in winter. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped there for a while. Not because she lacked more to say, but because the words needed room around them. She wanted to tell the next person about roof lines and county forms, about mortar that should not be too proud, about oily rags laid flat under stones, about DAP 33 warmed in the hand, about cotton sash cord and figure-8 knots, about hemp that lied when damp and snapped when cold. She wanted to tell them that inheritance could feel like burden at first because it arrived asking for work. She wanted to tell them to keep records, to accept soup, to notice birds, to rest before bitterness made poor repairs. Most of all, she wanted to tell them that a house could be patient without being passive. Waiting was not emptiness. Waiting was a form of keeping. The pencil moved again. "If you have found this, then something has carried you farther than you expected to go." She wrote until the fire lowered and the rain stopped. She did not finish the letter that night. Some things deserved more than one sitting. Before bed, she folded the unfinished pages into the journal and placed them beneath Eleanor's original letter, not replacing it, only joining it. Years later, people would still pass the old harbour road without noticing the track unless they knew where to turn. The walnut trees would leaf out and shed, the creek would rise and fall, the county would update maps, misfile copies, correct them, and update them again. The cafe corkboard would yellow around the edges of new cards. Harlan's ledger would move from counter to shelf. Caleb's sign would weather at the corners and darken beautifully under rain. Inside the rope walk, the hooks would keep their iron patience. The twisting post would stand with its once hidden hollow closed but not forgotten. The floor would hold the marks of boots, chairs, dropped tools, and one young woman's first winter of work. The old glass would bend the light. The brass gauges would rest side by side in the drawer when not in use, one from Amos, one from Eleanor, both worn by hands that believed measurement could be an act of care. Hemp rope walk waits. It has always waited. And in the third slot from the left in Mrs. Voss's old cash drawer, beneath newer bills and above a paper band of ones, the $5 bill remained folded along its soft crease, marked in pencil on the edge with the parcel number, kept because Lenora Voss had decided some records belonged to the county and some belonged to Mercy.